Have you ever been erased by the people who were supposed to love you most? I stood in that glittering restaurant surrounded by 80 guests celebrating my parents' 40th anniversary, a party I'd spent weeks organising when my mother stood up and made an announcement that would change everything. Next week, the whole family is flying to Hawaii. Everyone erupted in applause. My heart swelled. Finally, I thought, finally, I'm included. I smiled and asked, "What time do we leave, Mum?" The room went silent. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "You don't need to know. You're not part of this family. Stay home and watch the grandkids." 80 people heard her erase me, but what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been carrying a letter in my pocket. A letter my father left me before he died. A letter that would expose every lie they'd built their perfect family on. So I pulled it out and I read it aloud. And my answer didn't just shut them down, it destroyed them. Stay with me, because this is just the beginning of how I made them all pay. My name is Jessica Parker. I'm 37 years old, a high school English teacher in a small town where everyone knows your name, but nobody really knows your story. I've lived my entire life in the shadow of a family that never quite had room for me. Always on the periphery, always just outside the frame. And on the day of my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, that truth became impossible to ignore. The morning of the party, I arrived at my parents' house at 7 a.m, 2 hours before anyone else. Mum had given me a list of tasks the week before. Dust the living room, arrange the flowers, set up the guest book table, coordinate with the caterers. My sister Emily would handle the toast. My brother Ryan would greet guests at the door. I would make sure everything ran smoothly behind the scenes, invisible as always. I moved through the living room with a dustcloth methodically wiping down picture frames on the mantel. There were so many photos, Emily's wedding, Ryan's college graduation, family vacations, I'd never been invited to join. And then there was the large family portrait from 5 years ago, mounted in an ornate silver frame on the highest shelf. In it, we stood in front of the old oak tree in the backyard, Mum and Dad in the centre, arms around each other, Emily on Mum's right, Ryan on Dad's left, and me off to the side, half a step back, my smile just a little too tight. I reached up to dust the frame, stretching on my toes. My fingers barely brushed the edge when it slipped. I lunged to catch it, but it tumbled through my hands and crashed onto the hardwood floor. The sound was like a gunshot. Glass exploded across the floor in a starburst pattern. I dropped to my knees, my heart hammering, already imagining Mum's fury. But when I looked down at the broken frame, my breath caught. A single, jagged crack ran through the glass, splitting the image cleanly. It cut right through my face as if the photograph itself had decided I didn't belong there. I heard footsteps. Mum appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She glanced at the shattered frame, then at me kneeling among the shards. "That's why it broke. Mark," she said, her voice flat and cold. "You never fit in that picture anyway." I looked up at her, waiting for something, concern, irritation, anything human. But she just turned on her heel and walked toward the kitchen, calling over her shoulder, "The caterers will be here in 20 minutes. Clean that up before anyone sees it." I stayed there on my knees, staring at the broken photograph. Slowly, carefully, I picked up the largest piece of glass. My hand was shaking. The edge bit into my finger before I even realised it was sharp. A thin line of red appeared bright against my skin. I watched, almost detached, as a drop of blood fell from my fingertip and landed directly on the photograph, on my face. The red spread across the glossy paper, blurring my features, soaking into the image, until I was nothing but a dark, shapeless stain. It looked like I'd been erased, like I'd never been there at all. I pressed my bleeding finger against my palm and whispered to the empty room, maybe that picture was never meant to include me. But as I knelt there among the shattered glass, I felt something shift inside me. Because tonight, at that anniversary party, everything was about to change. Tonight, they would finally see me, and they would regret every moment they pretended I didn't exist. That shift I felt on my knees in the living room stayed with me through the entire day. It hummed beneath my skin as I bandaged my finger, as I swept up the glass as I drove to the restaurant 3 hours early to meet the florist. It steadied my hands as I arranged white lilies and gardenias on every table, as I checked the seating chart for the 4th time as I confirmed with the pianist that he had the song list Mum had chosen. I moved through the preparations like a ghost, efficient and silent, while Emily arrived an hour before the party started to touch up her makeup, and Ryan showed up 30 minutes late, blaming traffic. By the time the guests began arriving, I had faded into the background completely. That was my role after all. The organizer, the helper, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly so that Mom, Dad Emily, and Ryan could shine. The restaurant was beautiful. Candlelight reflected off crystal glasses. The room buzzed with laughter and conversation as 80 guests filled the space. Aunts, uncles, cousins, I barely knew business partners of my father's friends from my mother's country club. I stood near the entrance checking names off the guest list, directing people to their tables, accepting coats. Emily and Ryan stood at the centre of the room, with our parents posing for photographs, their smiles wide and effortless. A professional photographer circled them like they were celebrities. I watched from the doorway as Dad swayed slightly on his feet. He'd been weak since his heart attack 5 years ago, frailer every year, but tonight he was trying to stand tall. I moved toward him instinctively, reaching out to steady his elbow. "Dad, do you need to sit down?" I asked softly. Before he could answer, Mum's hand shot out and gripped his other arm, pulling him slightly away from me. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes were ice. "I'll handle my husband," she said, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Go make sure the caterers know when to bring out the champagne." I stepped back. Dad glanced at me, something apologetic flickering in his eyes, but he said nothing. He never did. Dinner was served. I sat at a table near the back beside a couple I didn't recognise. They asked polite questions about my job, my life, and I gave polite answers, all while watching my family at the head table. Emily laughed loudly, tossing her hair. Ryan raised his glass in toast after toast. Mum and Dad sat like royalty, accepting congratulations, basking in the attention. Then, halfway through the main course, Mum stood. The room quieted immediately. She tapped her champagne glass with a fork and the pianist stopped playing. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight," she began, her voice warm and gracious. 40 years ago, Robert and I made a promise to each other. Through every challenge, every triumph, every joy, we've kept that promise. And we couldn't have done it without our incredible family. She gestured to Emily and Ryan, who stood and joined her. The 3 of them looked like a magazine ad for perfect families. I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap. And to celebrate this milestone, Mum continued, her smile widening. "Next week, our whole family is flying to Hawaii for 10 days. It's our gift to ourselves, a chance to rest, to reconnect, and to make new memories together." The room exploded in applause. Guests whistled and cheered. Emily beamed. Ryan raised his glass. And for one foolish, hopeful second, I thought maybe, just maybe, I was included. I smiled and called out, "What time do we leave, Mum?" The applause died. The room went still. Mum turned to look at me. Her expression didn't change. She didn't look angry or surprised. She looked calm, decided. "You don't need to know," she said clearly, deliberately, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "You're not part of this family. Stay home and watch the grandkids." 80 people stared at me. I felt their pity, their shock, their discomfort crash over me like a wave. My face burned, my throat tightened. For 5 seconds I couldn't breathe. And then I felt it again, that shift, that quiet, unshakable resolve. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope Dad had given me last Christmas. I'd carried it with me for months, unopened, saving it for when I needed it most. This was that moment. I stood, slowly opened the envelope, and unfolded the letter inside. My hands were steady, my voice was clear. To my dearest, Jessica. I read aloud, who stayed when staying meant everything. You are the heart this family forgot to protect. I'm proud of you. Always, Dad. December 23. The silence that followed was absolute. I looked up and met my mother's eyes. All the colour had drained from her face. Emily stared at her plate, frozen. Ryan glanced between Mum and me, his mouth slightly open. I folded the letter carefully, walked to the head table and placed it in front of my mother. You're right, Mum, I said softly. I'm not part of this family anymore. But one day, you'll wish I still were. I turned, thanked the guests for coming, and walked out of that restaurant with my head high. Behind me, I heard the whispers begin low and urgent, spreading like wildfire. They finally said out loud what I'd always felt, and now everyone had heard it. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could turn the key. My hands were shaking, not from anger, but from the weight of finally hearing the truth spoken aloud. The restaurant's warm lights glowed behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to drive away just yet. Instead, I stared at the letter still clutched in my hand, Dad's handwriting blurred by tears I refused to let fall. They finally said out loud what I'd always felt. And now, everyone had heard it. But the truth was I'd known for far longer than tonight. I'd known since I was 12 years old. I closed my eyes and let the memory come. I was in 7th grade when Mum sat me down at the kitchen table and explained that Emily needed my bedroom. Emily was 8, and according to Mum, she was entering a critical developmental stage where creative expression required space. She needed room for her art supplies, her dollhouse collection, her dance trophies. My small bedroom had better lighting, a bigger closet, and a window that faced the garden. You're older, Mum said, her tone matter-of-fact, as if she were explaining a simple math problem. You understand sacrifice. Emily's still growing. She needs this. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say that I was still growing too, that I had homework and books and dreams that needed space. But the way Mum looked at me, expectant, impatient, already decided made it clear that my opinion didn't matter. So I nodded. They moved me into the storage room at the end of the hall. It was barely 10 feet by 8 feet, with no windows and a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. I slept on a twin mattress wedged between cardboard boxes labelled holiday decorations and old tax documents. I hung a poster on the wall to cover the water stain. I told myself it was temporary. I stayed in that room for 3 years. Every night I heard Emily laughing in my old bedroom, heard her music playing, heard Mum reading her bedtime stories. And I lay in the dark among the boxes, doing my homework by a flashlight, so I wouldn't bother anyone learning that taking up less space was the price of being loved, or at least tolerated. That memory dissolved and another one surfaced sharper and more painful. I was 22, standing on a stage in a black graduation gown with gold honours cords draped around my neck. The auditorium was packed with families, cheering cameras, flashing parents crying with pride. I scanned the crowd as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, searching for my family's faces. They weren't there. I shook the dean's hand, smiled for the university photographer, and walked off the stage alone. My hands were trembling as I clutched my diploma. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe they were running late, maybe they'd gotten lost, maybe they were waiting outside. But I knew. I checked my phone in the parking lot after the ceremony. One missed call from Dad, one voicemail. His voice was apologetic, strained. Hey, sweetheart, I'm so sorry we couldn't make it. Your mother scheduled Emily's 18th birthday party today, and, well, you know how important this is for her. She's been planning it for months. We'll celebrate you next week, I promise. Congratulations, Jess. We're proud of you. I stood there in the parking lot, still wearing my cap and gown, watching other families take pictures and go out to celebratory dinners. I waited for next week. I waited for the phone call, the dinner reservation, the acknowledgement that I'd graduated summa cum laude, that I'd earned scholarships, that I'd worked 2 jobs to pay for books and rent. Next week never came. I drove back to my apartment alone that day, hung my diploma on the wall, and ordered Chinese takeout. I ate it in silence, still wearing my honours cords because I wanted someone, even if it was just me, to see that I'd accomplished something. That memory faded, and I felt the steering wheel solid under my palms again, grounding me in the present. But there was one more memory I couldn't ignore, the one that still stung the most. Christmas 2020. 4 years ago, but it might as well have been yesterday. We gathered in the living room on Christmas morning, the tree lit up with white lights presents stacked beneath it like a magazine spread. I sat on the couch with a mug of coffee watching as Mum handed out gifts. She always made a production of it, saving the biggest surprises for last. Emily opened a small box first, and inside was a set of car keys. She screamed, literally screamed. Mum and Dad had bought her a brand new sedan, white with a red bow on top, parked in the driveway. Emily cried and hugged them, and we all went outside to admire it. I clapped along with everyone else, genuinely happy for her, even though I'd been driving the same used Honda I bought myself in college. Back inside, Ryan opened his gift, a sleek new laptop for his graphic design work. Top of the line. He grinned and immediately started setting it up. Then, Mum handed me a gift bag. It was light, almost empty. I reached inside and pulled out a sweater. It was burgundy, soft wool, but unmistakably worn. I recognised it immediately. It was one of Mum's old sweaters, one she'd worn for years and had recently talked about donating. I thought you could use something warm, Mum said, smiling as if she'd given me something thoughtful. I looked at Dad. He was staring down at his hands, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. He never said anything. I forced a smile. Thank you. It's lovely. I folded the sweater carefully, hiding my face, so no one would see the humiliation burning in my eyes. That night I drove home and shoved the sweater into the back of my closet. I never wore it. But I never threw it away either. It sat there like evidence. I opened my eyes and stared out the windshield at the dark parking lot. Those 3 moments, and 100 others like them, had taught me the same lesson over and over again. I learned early that love could mean being invisible. But tonight, something had changed. Tonight, they hadn't just made me invisible. They tried to erase me completely in front of 80 witnesses, and in doing so, they'd finally set me free. I started the car, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove toward Aunt Mary's house. She'd told me weeks ago that if I ever needed a place to think her door was open. I hadn't understood why at the time. Now I did. The roads were empty as I drove, streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. My mind kept circling back to the same question: how had I survived 37 years of being invisible? What kept me coming back, hoping, waiting for things to change? The answer came to me as I turned onto the highway. It was because of one person, one Christmas, one moment when I was finally seen. Christmas 2023. Less than a year ago, though, it felt like a lifetime. I pulled into Aunt Mary's driveway but didn't get out of the car yet. Instead, I let the memory wash over me because I needed to remember why I was doing this, why tonight mattered, why Dad's letter mattered. It had been the quietest Christmas of my life. Emily had flown to Aspen with her husband for a luxury ski trip. Ryan was spending the holidays in Paris with his girlfriend. Mum had been furious that neither of them would be home, but she'd adjusted quickly, planning an elaborate Christmas Eve dinner with friends instead. She hadn't invited me to that either. So, on Christmas morning, I showed up at my parents' house alone, carrying a tin of homemade cookies and a bottle of wine, expecting to find the house empty or Mum in one of her cold, distant moods. Instead, I found Dad sitting by the fireplace in his old leather chair, a plaid blanket over his knees, staring into the flames. He looked up when I walked in, and his face broke into the kind of smile I hadn't seen in years. Genuine, warm, relieved. "You came?" he said, his voice soft. Of course I came, I replied, setting the cookies on the side table. It's Christmas. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit with me for a while. We didn't talk at first. We just sat there, the fire crackling between us, the house unusually still. There was no music playing, no television on in the background, no chaos of wrapping paper and laughter. Just the two of us and the warmth of the fire. After a while, Dad reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a small velvet box. He held it in his palm for a moment, running his thumb over the worn fabric, then extended it toward me. I want you to have this, he said. I opened the box carefully. Inside was a gold pocket watch scratched and tarnished with age, the kind that belonged to another era. I lifted it out and the weight of it surprised me. It was real, solid, heavy with history. This was my father's, Dad said quietly. He gave it to me when I turned 18. Told me that time was the only thing we can't buy back, so we'd better spend it on people who matter. He paused, his eyes glistening. You're the only one who still shows up on time for family, Jess. The only one who still shows up at all. My throat tightened. I ran my fingers over the watch's surface, feeling the engraving on the back, to Robert with love. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just nodded. Dad smiled and pushed himself up from his chair with effort. Come on, let's make this Christmas worth remembering. We spent the next hour doing something we hadn't done since I was a child, roasting marshmallows over the fire. Dad found an old bag of them in the pantry, and we skewered them on long forks, holding them over the flames until they turned golden and gooey. We laughed when mine caught fire. We argued playfully about whether burnt marshmallows tasted better than perfectly toasted ones. And then, as we sat there licking sticky fingers, Dad started telling me stories. Stories I had never heard before. He told me about his first job as a teenager, working at a hardware store and saving every penny to buy his first car. He told me about the day he met Mum at a college dance, how she'd been wearing a blue dress and wouldn't give him the time of day until he made her laugh. He told me about the early years of their marriage, when they were broke and happy before everything got complicated. I listened, absorbing every word, every detail, holding the pocket watch in my lap like a talisman. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I felt like I mattered, like my presence wasn't just tolerated but wanted, like I wasn't invisible. I'm proud of you, Jess, Dad said suddenly, his voice breaking slightly. I don't say it enough, but I am. You've got a good heart. Don't let anyone take that from you. Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them back. Thank you, Dad. He squeezed my hand and we sat in comfortable silence watching the fire burn low. Then the front door opened. Mum walked in, her coat still on her face, tight and unreadable. She glanced at the two of us by the fire, at the marshmallow forks, at the pocket watch gleaming in my hands. Her expression didn't soften. How touching, she said, her voice flat and cold. That's because she has nowhere else to be. She didn't wait for a response. She just turned and walked toward the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Dad's face fell. He looked down at his hands and I saw the shame there, the exhaustion of a man who'd spent 40 years trying to keep the peace and failing. He didn't defend me. He never did. I stood slowly, slipping the pocket watch into my coat pocket. I looked out the window at the snow falling softly in the yard, the world outside blanketed in white and silent. The firelight reflected off the glass, and for a moment I saw my own face staring back at me, tired, sad, but still here. I should go, I said quietly. Dad stood and walked me to the door. Before I could leave, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in his careful handwriting. Don't open this now, he said, pressing it into my hands. Open it when you need it most. I looked at him confused, but he just smiled and kissed my forehead. Merry Christmas, sweetheart. I tucked the envelope into my coat pocket, alongside the watch, thinking it was just a sentimental note. Something I'd read later when I was feeling nostalgia. I didn't open it that night. I didn't open it for months. I sat in Aunt Mary's driveway, now holding that same envelope, the one I'd finally opened and read aloud at the anniversary party. The one that had changed everything. He was the only one who ever saw me. And now, he's gone. He was the only one who ever saw me. And now, he's gone. But sitting there in Aunt Mary's driveway, staring at the letter in my trembling hands, I realised that wasn't entirely true. Dad was gone, yes, but he'd left something behind. Not just the letter I'd read at the party tonight, but something more. Something I'd found 3 days after his funeral, something that had been waiting for me all along. I needed to go back to that moment. I needed to remember how this all started. It was October 2023. 3 days after we buried Dad in the cemetery on the hill under the oak tree he'd always loved. The funeral had been small and strained. Mum had stayed dry-eyed and composed, accepting condolences with a gracious nod. Emily had cried beautifully, her mascara perfectly intact. Ryan had delivered a eulogy about Dad's integrity and generosity that sounded like it had been written by someone who barely knew him. And I had stood in the back silent, holding the pocket watch Dad had given me that Christmas, feeling like I'd lost the only person who'd ever truly seen me. Mum asked me to clean out Dad's study. Not asked, really. Told. Someone needs to go through his papers, she'd said the morning after the funeral, her tone brisk and businesslike. I can't do it. It's too painful. You're good at organising. Translation, I was good at doing the work no one else wanted to do. So I went to the house while Mum was at her book club and let myself into Dad's study. It smelled like him old leather tobacco from the pipe he'd quit smoking years ago, and the faint scent of the cedar drawer liners he'd insisted on. I stood in the doorway for a long time, unable to move, feeling the weight of his absence in every corner of that room. Finally, I started sorting. I went through his desk drawers methodically, setting aside documents for the attorney, personal letters for the family, old bills to be shredded. I worked slowly, reading some of the letters, smiling at his terrible handwriting, aching at the little notes he'd written to himself on scraps of paper. Pay electric bill, call Jess on her birthday, fix Margaret's car. I pulled out the bottom drawer, the one that had always stuck, and that's when I saw it. Taped to the underside of the drawer was an envelope, not just placed there casually, but taped deliberately hidden. My name was written on the front in Dad's handwriting. For Jessica open when I'm gone. My heart stopped. I peeled the tape carefully, my hands shaking, and turned the envelope over. It was sealed with red wax, old-fashioned and deliberate. Inside, I found 2 things: a handwritten letter on Dad's personal stationery and a small brass key. I unfolded the letter and read it right there, sitting on the floor of his study, the afternoon light streaming through the window. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Jess, silence hides the truth, but you were born to uncover it. I made a will in 2020, everything split equally among you, 33% each. If they tell you otherwise, something went wrong. Look for the box at St. Michael's Church, Father. Thomas knows where. The recording inside will speak when I cannot. I'm sorry I didn't protect you enough while I was alive, but I can still protect you now. I love you. Dad. I read it 3 times, trying to make sense of it. A will, 33% each. A box at the church. A recording. What recording? And why did he think something might go wrong? I sat there for an hour, holding that letter and the brass key, staring at the words until they blurred. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the paranoid ramblings of a sick man. But another part of me, the part that had spent a lifetime being dismissed and erased, knew better. Dad didn't write things like this unless he meant them. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it into my purse along with the key, and left the house without telling anyone what I'd found. The following week, I received a call from the family attorney, Gerald Whitmore, asking me to come to his office to discuss the estate. I assumed it was standard procedure, signing documents, reviewing assets, the kind of administrative work that follows every death. I wore a black dress and drove to his office downtown, expecting a brief formal meeting. Gerald was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been Dad's attorney for over 20 years. He greeted me with a somber handshake and gestured for me to sit across from his mahogany desk. "I'm very sorry for your loss," he said, his tone rehearsed but not unkind. "Your father was a good man." "Thank you," I said quietly. He opened a leather folder and slid a document across the desk toward me. "This is the will your father filed in January of this year. I wanted to review the distribution with you directly." I glanced down at the document. My eyes scanned the text and then froze. Margaret Parker, 60%. Emily Parker, 25%. Ryan Parker, 15%. Jessica Parker, 0%. The air left my lungs. I read it again, certain I'd misunderstood, but the numbers didn't change. "That's impossible," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Dad told me he split everything equally, 33% each." Gerald adjusted his glasses and looked at me with something that might have been pity. "I'm just reading what was filed, Ms. Parker. This is the most recent will on record, dated and notarized in January 24. Is there a problem?" A problem? He was asking if there was a problem. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "I need time to check something." I didn't wait for his response. I grabbed my purse and walked out of his office, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might collapse. I made it to my car before the tears came, hot and furious and full of a rage I'd been swallowing for 37 years. I drove straight to the cemetery. I parked at the base of the hill and walked up to Dad's grave. The headstone was still new, the earth still freshly turned. I knelt in the grass, pulled the letter from my purse and read it again, my hand shaking so badly the paper rattled. He knew. Dad knew someone would try to change the will. He knew I'd be erased. That's why he left the letter. That's why he hid the key. That's why he told me to go to the church. I pressed my forehead against the cold stone of his headstone and whispered, "I'll find it, Dad. I'll find whatever you left me. I promise." The wind picked up rustling the leaves of the oak tree above me. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice, steady, calm, certain. He left me silence to turn into voice. I stayed at Dad's grave until the sun began to set, the sky turning pink and orange above the oak tree. I traced my fingers over the letters carved into his headstone, trying to draw strength from the stone from the memory of him. But the question that kept circling in my mind wasn't about Dad. It was about Mum. Why did she hate me so much? It wasn't just indifference or neglect, those I'd learned to live with. This was active resentment, the kind that metastasizes over time, the kind that leads a woman to erase her own daughter from a will. I needed to understand when it started. When did coldness turn to hatred? And then, sitting there in the fading light, I remembered. It was 6 years ago. The spring of 2018. I was 31 years old, and for the first time in my life, everything was finally falling into place. I'd been teaching English at the local high school for 9 years, pouring my heart into lesson plans and after-school tutoring, watching kids I'd taught go off to college and send me thank you cards years later. But I'd always dreamed of something more. I wanted to teach at the university level, to work with students who chose to be there, to have time for research and writing. I'd been applying to tenure-track positions for 3 years, sending out applications every semester, collecting rejection letters like bitter souvenirs. And then, in March, I got the call. Boston University. Associate Professor of English Literature. Tenure-track. Salary $95,000 a year. It was everything I'd worked toward my entire career. When the department chair offered me the position over the phone, I sat in my tiny apartment and cried with relief and joy and disbelief. I gave my notice at the high school. I started apartment hunting in Boston online, browsing listings for studios with brick walls and big windows overlooking tree-lined streets. I imagined myself walking through campus in the fall carrying a leather satchel full of books, having coffee with colleagues who cared about literature as much as I did. I let myself dream. I was supposed to start in August. I had 4 months to pack up my life and move. Then 2 weeks before my lease in Boston was set to begin, my phone rang at 3 in the morning. It was Mum. Her voice was sharp and cold, the way it always was, but there was something underneath it, panic, maybe, or fury. "Your father is in intensive care," she said without preamble. "Massive heart attack. They don't know if he'll make it through the night. If you leave now, you'll regret it forever." I was out of bed and in my car within 10 minutes, still wearing pajama pants under my coat. I drove the 40 minutes to the hospital in a daze, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, my mind refusing to process what was happening. Dad couldn't die. Not yet. Not like this. When I got to the ICU, Mum was standing in the hallway with Emily and Ryan. Emily was crying into her husband's shoulder. Ryan was pacing, his phone pressed to his ear. Mum stood perfectly still, her arms crossed, staring at the closed door to Dad's room. She barely looked at me when I arrived. "He's stable now," she said, "but the damage is severe. He'll need full-time care for months, maybe longer." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I asked if I could see him, and the nurse let me in for 5 minutes. He looked so small in that hospital bed, tubes running from his arms, monitors beeping steadily. His eyes were closed, his face grey. I held his hand and told him I loved him, and I wasn't sure if he heard me. Over the next week, as Dad stabilised and was moved out of intensive care, the reality of the situation became clear. He would survive, but recovery would be long and difficult. He needed someone to manage his medications, drive him to physical therapy appointments, monitor his diet, help him with daily tasks he couldn't do alone anymore. Mum made it clear she couldn't do it. She had her commitments, her book club, her charity boards, her social calendar. Emily had young children. Ryan lived 2 hours away and travelled constantly for work. That left me. I called the department chair at Boston University and asked if I could defer my start date by a semester. He said they'd already hired someone else to fill the gap while they waited for my arrival. If I didn't start in August, they'd have to give the position to that person permanently. I asked for an exception. He said he was sorry, but there were no exceptions. I cancelled my lease in Boston. I withdrew my acceptance letter. I returned to my tiny apartment in my hometown and moved back into the role I'd always played, the one who stayed, the one who sacrificed, the one who made herself small so everyone else could shine. For the next 5 years, I was Dad's primary caregiver. I managed his pill organiser, colour-coded by day and time. I drove him to cardiology appointments, physical therapy sessions, follow-up visits. I learned to cook low-sodium meals that didn't taste like cardboard. I helped him walk up and down the hallway when his legs were weak. I sat with him during the sleepless nights when the fear of another heart attack kept him awake. Mum was rarely there. She'd stop by once a week, check that the house was clean, ask if Dad needed anything, then leave within 20 minutes. She never thanked me. Not once. Then one night, about a year after Dad's heart attack, we were having dinner at their house, just the 3 of us. I'd cooked a baked chicken with steamed vegetables, Dad's cardiologist-approved meal plan. Mum picked at her food in silence, while Dad and I talked about a book he was reading. When I got up to clear the plates, Mum spoke. "You know, if you just let him handle his own recovery, he'd be stronger by now." I stopped holding a stack of dishes and turned to look at her. "What?" She didn't look at me. She stared at her wine glass, turning the stem between her fingers. "You chained him to that bed with your pity. He could have recovered faster without your hovering." I stood there frozen, waiting for Dad to say something to defend me, to tell her that wasn't true. But he just looked down at his hands, his jaw tight, silent. I set the dishes down carefully, afraid I might drop them. "I'm helping him recover." "You're smothering him," Mum said, her voice icy. "You gave up your little teaching job, and now you've made him feel guilty about it. Every time he looks at you, he sees what you sacrificed. It's exhausting for him. It's exhausting for all of us. I left the house that night and didn't come back for a week, but I kept taking Dad to his appointments. I kept managing his medications. I kept showing up because someone had to. Looking back now, kneeling at Dad's grave 6 years later, I finally understood. Mum didn't resent me because I'd sacrificed too much. She resented me because my sacrifice highlighted everything she wasn't willing to do. Every pill I sorted, every appointment I drove him to, every meal I cooked, it was a mirror held up to her absence. And instead of feeling guilt or gratitude, she felt rage. So she punished me, not just emotionally, but materially, legally. She erased me from the will the same way she'd been erasing me from the family for 37 years. I stood slowly brushing dirt from my knees and whispered to the headstone, maybe loving too much was my biggest mistake, or maybe it was my greatest proof. I'd been asking myself that question for a week, sitting in Aunt Mary's cabin, staring out at the frozen lake, Dad's letter spread on the table in front of me beside the brass key. The anniversary party felt like it had happened a lifetime ago, though it had only been 7 days. 7 days of complete silence from my family. No phone calls, no texts, not even an angry email from Mum demanding I apologise for embarrassing her in front of 80 guests. Just silence. I told myself I wasn't waiting for an apology. I told myself I didn't care. But every time my phone buzzed with a notification, a spam email, a reminder from the dentist, a news alert, my heart would leap for just a second before sinking again. Then, on the 7th day, my phone chimed with an email. I grabbed it immediately, and my stomach dropped when I saw the sender, Family Travel Plans group thread. I opened it. The subject line read, Hawaii itinerary, final details. I scrolled through the message. Flight times, hotel confirmation numbers, car rental information, restaurant reservations. Every detail meticulously planned, every family member's name listed. Margaret Parker, Emily Parker, Ryan Parker, plus Emily's husband and their 2 children. I scrolled down to the recipient list. My email address wasn't there. I refreshed the page twice, thinking it was a glitch. But no, I'd been removed from the group thread entirely. They hadn't just excluded me from the trip, they'd erased me from the conversation about it. I wasn't even worth the courtesy of an explanation. I set the phone down on the table and stared at it for a long time, waiting for something to surface. Anger, hurt, betrayal. But what came instead was clarity. Cold, sharp, undeniable clarity. They were never going to acknowledge what happened. They were never going to apologise or explain or even pretend to care. In their minds, I'd already been written out of the story. The Hawaii trip was just the next chapter in a narrative that no longer included me. Fine. I picked up my phone and opened my calendar. Their flight was scheduled for tomorrow morning, February 10th, at 9 a.m. I sat there for a moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then I made a decision. I wasn't going to reach out. I wasn't going to beg for inclusion. I was going to watch. The next morning, I woke up at dawn and drove back to town. I parked 2 blocks away from Mum's house, close enough to see, but far enough to remain invisible. My apartment was directly across the street from hers, a fact that had always felt convenient before, but now felt like cosmic irony. I climbed the stairs to my 2nd-floor unit, unlocked the door and went straight to the window. From there, I had a perfect view of Mum's front door. I made coffee and stood by the window holding the warm mug in both hands, watching the house like a detective on a stakeout. At 8:15, the front door opened. Emily came out first, dragging 2 oversized suitcases, her children trailing behind her in matching Disney shirts. Her husband followed with a backpack and a carry-on. They were all laughing about something the sound carrying across the quiet street. Then Ryan appeared, phone pressed to his ear, nodding at whatever the person on the other end was saying. He tossed his bag into the open trunk of the taxi that had just pulled up. And then Mum stepped out. She was wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and oversized sunglasses, dressed like she was already on vacation. She locked the front door with care, tested the handle twice, then turned toward the waiting taxi. And that's when she looked up. Her gaze swept across the street, landing directly on my window. Our eyes met. I didn't move. I didn't smile or wave or look away. I just stood there, holding my coffee, staring back at her with the same expressionless calm she'd given me my entire life. For 3 full seconds, we looked at each other across that distance. I wondered what she saw when she looked at me. Did she feel guilt, regret, or was I still just the inconvenient daughter who refused to disappear quietly? Then she turned away, climbed into the taxi and closed the door, without a wave, without a glance back, without any acknowledgement that I existed. Ryan was still staring at his phone, oblivious. Emily was buckling her kids into their car seats, chattering brightly. None of them looked up. None of them wondered if I was watching. They simply drove away, the taxi disappearing around the corner, leaving the street silent and empty. I stood at that window for a long time after they were gone, my coffee growing cold in my hands. I didn't cry. I'd cried enough over the years, silent tears in storage rooms and parking lots, and lonely apartments. I was done crying. What I felt now wasn't sadness. It was something sharper, something that tasted like steel. Purpose. I set the coffee mug down and turned away from the window. I walked to my bedroom and pulled a duffel bag from the closet. I packed quickly and deliberately. A few changes of clothes, toiletries, my laptop and charger, and then the things that mattered: Dad's letter carefully folded in its envelope, the brass key small and cold in my palm, the broken picture frame glass still cracked down the middle, and the gold pocket watch heavy and warm ticking steadily against my hand. I zipped the bag closed and stood in the middle of my small apartment looking around at the life I'd built here. It had always felt temporary, like I was waiting for permission to take up more space, to want more, to be more. But I was done waiting for permission. I picked up my phone and called Aunt Mary. "I need your help," I said when she answered. "I've been waiting for you to say that," she replied. "Come back to the cabin. We have work to do." I grabbed my bag, locked the apartment, and walked down the stairs without looking back. As I drove out of town, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time at the place I'd spent my entire life trying to belong. They thought I was staying home to watch the kids. They'd soon see what I was really watching for. The drive back to Aunt Mary's cabin took 45 minutes, but it felt longer. My mind was racing, trying to organise everything I knew into something coherent, something actionable. I had a letter from Dad telling me to look for a box at St. Michael's Church. I had a brass key that presumably opened something. I had evidence that the will had been changed. But I didn't have a plan, and I didn't have anyone to help me execute one. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, Aunt Mary was standing on the porch, arms crossed, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was 62, Dad's younger sister by 8 years, with silver-streaked hair she wore in a practical braid and the kind of weathered face that came from years of hiking and gardening. She'd never married, never had children, and had always lived life exactly on her own terms, something Mum had always resented about her. I grabbed my duffel bag and climbed the porch steps. Before I could say anything, Mary pulled me into a tight hug. "I've been waiting for you to come back," she said quietly. "I didn't know where else to go," I admitted. She pulled back and looked at me with fierce, bright eyes. "You came to exactly the right place. Come inside. We need to talk." I followed her into the cabin. The living room smelled like wood smoke and coffee. She gestured for me to sit on the worn leather couch while she poured 2 mugs from a French press on the kitchen counter. She handed me one and settled into the chair across from me. "Your father sent me a letter too," she said without preamble. 4 months ago, October, right before he died. I set my mug down carefully. "What did it say?" Mary stood, walked to a bookshelf and pulled down a hardcover copy of Moby Dick. She opened it and withdrew an envelope that had been tucked inside. She handed it to me. The envelope was addressed to Mary Parker in Dad's handwriting. I looked at her and she nodded permission. I opened it and read, "Mary, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if Jessica comes to you, it means things went exactly as I feared. Margaret is angrier than I realise. I've tried to protect Jess, but I won't be there to finish what I started. Help her. She'll have a letter and a key. She'll need guidance. Don't let them erase her the way I let them silence her for too long. She's stronger than any of them know. Make sure she sees it too. Robert. I folded the letter slowly, my hands trembling. When did you get this? A week after his funeral, Mary said. He mailed it the day before he died. I didn't understand it fully at the time. I thought maybe he was being overly protective, paranoid even. But then I heard about what happened at the anniversary party. She leaned forward. Jessica, your father knew something was wrong, and he wasn't the only one. What do you mean? Mary's face darkened. In December, about 2 weeks before he died, I drove down to visit him. I hadn't seen him in months and I wanted to check on him. When I got there, the house was tense. Your mother barely acknowledged me. She said Robert was resting and I shouldn't bother him. She paused, taking a sip of coffee, her jaw tight. But I went upstairs anyway, and as I was walking down the hall toward his study, I heard shouting. Your mother's voice, loud and vicious. I stopped outside the door. What was she saying? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mary's eyes met mine. She was screaming at him. Jessica doesn't deserve anything. She ruined your health by making you dependent. Every time I look at her, I see the daughter who stole you from me. And your father, his voice so weak I could barely hear him, said, That's not true, Margaret. She saved my life. My throat closed. I couldn't speak. Mary continued. I pushed the door open. Your mother whirled around and saw me standing there. I'll never forget the look on her face, pure rage. She marched over and slammed the door in my face, literally. Locked it. I knocked, called out to Robert, but she wouldn't let me in. What did you do? I managed. I waited. 2 hours sitting in the hallway like a fool. When your mother finally came out, she walked past me like I didn't exist and left the house. I went in to check on Robert. He was sitting at his desk, pale, exhausted. I asked him what was going on. He said, I made provisions, Mary. If I don't make it help Jessica find the truth. I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to keep the tears from falling. He knew. He knew she'd try to cut me out. He knew, Mary confirmed, and he planned for it. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. That's why he left you that letter. That's why he involved Father Thomas. And that's why he asked me to help you when the time came. She set her mug down with a firm clink. Jessica, your mother didn't just change the will on a whim. She orchestrated this. And we're going to prove it. How? I asked, my voice breaking. I'm a high school teacher, Mary. I don't know anything about legal battles or estate law or fighting people who have money and power. Mary smiled, and there was something almost predatory in it. That's why you're going to meet Walter Adams tomorrow morning. Who's Walter Adams? Your father's attorney for 30 years. He officially retired last year, but he and Robert were close. When Robert died, Walter suspected something was off about the will filing. He reached out to me a month ago, said if you ever needed help, he'd come out of retirement to take the case. Pro bono. Relief flooded through me so fast it almost hurt. He'd do that. He would. He will. Mary pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. And I've also arranged for you to meet someone else, a private investigator named Mark Reynolds. He's young, 32, but he's one of the best in the state. Specializes in estate fraud, document forensics, financial trails. If there's evidence your mother tampered with, that Mark will find it. I stared at her, overwhelmed. Why are you doing all this? Mary reached across the table and took my hand. Because your father asked me to. Because you're my niece and I've watched you be erased by that family for 37 years. And because it's time someone fought for you the way you fought for everyone else. She squeezed my hand. Stay here at the cabin as long as you need. Plan, strategize. Walter and Mark will be here tomorrow at 10. We'll figure this out together. For the first time in a week, I felt something loosen in my chest. I wasn't fighting alone anymore. I wasn't alone anymore, and that changed everything. I woke at dawn, the cabin still dark and quiet. Mary was asleep in the bedroom down the hall, her soft snoring barely audible through the thin walls. I dressed quickly, pulling on jeans and a sweater, and slipped the brass key into my jacket pocket. I left a note on the kitchen counter. Gone to St. Michael's. Back by 9:30. The drive to the church took 20 minutes. St. Michael's sat on a hill at the edge of town, a small stone building with a white steeple and stained glass windows that glowed in the early morning light. Dad had been a parishioner here for 40 years, attending Mass every Sunday, until his health made it impossible. I'd gone with him sometimes, as a child, sitting in the wooden pews, watching dust motes dance in the coloured light. I parked in the empty lot and walked up the stone steps. The heavy wooden door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the church was dim and silent, smelling of incense and old wood. A few candles flickered near the altar. An elderly man in a black cassock emerged from a side door. Father Thomas. I recognised him immediately. Silver hair, kind eyes, a slight stoop in his shoulders. He'd presided over Dad's funeral. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm. "Can I help you?" I stepped forward, my hand instinctively moving to my pocket. "Father Thomas, I'm Jessica Parker, Robert Parker's daughter." His expression shifted immediately, something knowing and sad passing over his face. "Jessica, I've been expecting you." I blinked. "You have?" He nodded slowly. "Your father said you'd come. He said it might take time, but you'd come." He gestured toward the front pew. "Sit with me for a moment." We sat together in the quiet church. I could hear my own breathing, the faint creak of the pew beneath us. "Your father came to see me 3 times last December." Father Thomas began, his hands folded in his lap. "He was very ill by then, but he insisted on coming. He said he had something important to arrange, something that couldn't wait." "What did he want?" I asked. Father Thomas looked at me carefully. "He wanted to make sure you'd be protected. He said that if anything happened to him, there were people who would try to erase you. His word, not mine. Erase." He paused. "He left something in my care, something he wanted only you to have." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass key. My hand was shaking. "Is this what opens it?" Father Thomas stood. "Follow me." He led me through a side door down a narrow hallway and then down a steep flight of stairs into the church basement. It was cool and damp, lined with shelves, holding old hymnals, dusty boxes of decorations, folded tablecloths. At the far end of the basement was a small storage room with a heavy wooden door. Father Thomas produced a ring of keys from his cassock and unlocked it. Inside the room was barely larger than a closet. Metal shelves held various items, chalices, candlesticks, boxes labelled with years. But in the corner on the lowest shelf sat a small black safe no bigger than a shoebox. Father Thomas gestured to it. "Your father brought that here himself. He asked me to keep it locked in this room. He said only you would have the key." I knelt in front of the safe, my heart pounding. I inserted the brass key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the safe door clicked open. Inside was a wooden box, polished mahogany, with my name engraved on the lid in elegant script, Jessica. I lifted it out carefully, feeling its weight in my hands. Father Thomas stepped back, giving me space. I set the box on the floor and opened the lid. Inside, everything was meticulously organised. On top was a sealed envelope with my name on it. Beneath that, a stack of documents bound with a rubber band. A USB drive in a small plastic case. And at the very bottom, a second sealed envelope addressed to Margaret Parker, marked unsent. I picked up the stack of documents first. The top sheet was a last will and testament dated March 2020, notarized and signed by Robert James Parker. I scanned the distribution section. To my beloved children, Jessica Marie Parker, Emily Ann Parker, and Ryan Thomas Parker, I leave my estate to be divided equally among them, each receiving 33% of all assets, properties, and holdings. My breath caught. This was it, the original will, proof that Dad had intended to split everything equally. Beneath the will were medical records from St Mary's Hospital. I flipped through them quickly, cardiology reports, medication lists, appointment notes. And then, stamped across the top of a psychiatric evaluation dated December the 15th, 23, patient demonstrates full mental competency and decision-making capacity. No signs of cognitive impairment or diminished mental function. I looked up at Father Thomas. He knew someone would claim he wasn't competent. He knew, Father Thomas confirmed quietly. I set the documents aside and picked up the unsent letter to Margaret. My hands trembled as I opened it. Margaret, I know what you're planning. I heard you on the phone with your attorney discussing ways to contest the will, to argue that I'm not of sound mind. I know you want to cut Jessica out completely. I won't let you erase her. I've made provisions. If you go through with this, the truth will come out. I loved you once. I wish that had been enough. Robert, I folded the letter carefully, my vision blurring. Dad had known. He'd heard Mum plotting, planning, preparing to erase me, and he'd fought back the only way he could, with evidence, with documentation, with truth. Finally, I picked up the USB drive. Father Thomas, is there a computer I can use? He hesitated. There's one in the church office upstairs. It's old, but it works. We climbed back up the stairs. The office was small and cluttered with a desktop computer that looked like it was from 2010. Father Thomas turned it on, and we waited while it hummed and whirred to life. I plugged in the USB drive. A single audio file appeared on the screen. For Jessica. I clicked play. There was a moment of static, and then Dad's voice filled the small room. It was weak, hoarse, but unmistakably his. Jess, if you're hearing this, I'm gone. And something went wrong. I hoped it wouldn't come to this. I hoped your mother would honour what we agreed on. But if you're listening to this recording, it means she didn't. I pressed my hand over my mouth, tears spilling down my cheeks. I want you to know something, sweetheart. You are not invisible. You are not less than. You are the best of all of us, and I failed you by staying silent for so long. I let your mother push you aside. I let Emily and Ryan take and take without giving back. I told myself I was keeping the peace, but really, I was just a coward. His voice cracked, and there was a long pause. I made a will in 2020. Everything split equally the way it should be. But your mother's been pressuring me to change it. She wants to cut you out. She's convinced Emily and Ryan that you don't deserve anything because you gave up your career, as if loving me was a failure. Another pause. I could hear him breathing laboured and slow. Go to Father Thomas. He has the original will and the medical records. Go to Walter Adams, he'll help you fight this. And Jess, don't let them erase you the way I let them erase your voice for too long. You're stronger than all of them. I'm sorry I didn't protect you enough while I was alive, but I can still protect you now. I love you. I'm so proud of you. Don't forget that. The recording ended. I sat in that small church office, tears streaming down my face while Father Thomas stood quietly by the door. After a long moment, he spoke. He didn't come here to confess sins, Jessica. He came to confess silence, and he wanted to make sure that silence didn't bury you. I wiped my eyes and looked down at the USB drive in my hand. Dad had left me everything I needed. Documentation, testimony, his own voice speaking the truth. He'd built me a case, brick by brick, knowing he wouldn't be there to help me carry it. My father's silence was my mother's weapon. Now, it's mine. I stood across the street from Mom's house for 20 minutes before I crossed. It was Saturday evening, just after 6 o'clock. Through the windows, I could see movement shadows passing back and forth lights in every room. They were home. All of them. I'd copied the audio file from the USB drive onto my phone and synced it to a small Bluetooth speaker I'd bought that morning. The speaker sat in my purse now alongside my phone, the original Will and Dad's pocket watch. I was dressed simply, jeans, a grey sweater, my hair pulled back. I wanted to look calm, composed, unthreatening. I wanted them to underestimate me one more time. I crossed the street and climbed the front steps. I didn't knock. I used the key I'd had since I was 16, the one Mum had never asked me to return. The door opened and I stepped inside. The house smelled like coconut sunscreen and airport coffee. Suitcases were stacked in the entryway, half unpacked. A pile of Hawaiian shirts lay draped over the banister. I heard laughter coming from the kitchen. I walked down the hallway and stood in the doorway. They were all there. Mum at the counter pouring wine, Emily at the table with her phone showing Ryan photos, Ryan leaning over her shoulder grinning. They looked tan, relaxed, happy. I cleared my throat. They all turned at once. Mum's smile vanished. Emily's eyes went wide. Ryan straightened slowly, his expression unreadable. I smiled warmly as if nothing had happened. "Welcome home. How was the trip?" No one spoke for a long moment. Mum set down the wine bottle with a deliberate clink, her gaze cold and assessing. I could see her calculating, trying to figure out what I was doing here, what game I was playing. "Jessica," she said, finally, her voice flat. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to welcome you home," I said lightly. "I thought I'd cook dinner for everyone. It's been a long trip and I'm sure you're all exhausted." Emily shot a nervous glance at Ryan. Ryan was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Mum narrowed her eyes. "That's not necessary." "I insist," I said, my smile never wavering. "It's the least I can do." There was a tense pause. I could see Mum weighing her options. She could throw me out, but that would look petty, especially in front of Emily and Ryan. She could refuse my offer, but that would raise questions. Or she could accept and assume I'd finally learned my place, that I'd come crawling back, defeated and apologetic. She chose the latter. "Fine," she said curtly. "If you insist." I moved into the kitchen and began pulling ingredients from the refrigerator: chicken, vegetables, olive oil. I worked quickly and efficiently while they watched me in silence. Emily eventually returned to her phone. Ryan sat down at the table. Mum refilled her wine glass and leaned against the counter, sipping slowly, her eyes never leaving me. 30 minutes later, dinner was ready. I set the table with Mum's good china, the kind she only used for special occasions. I plated the food carefully: herb-roasted chicken, roasted asparagus, garlic mashed potatoes. I even lit candles in the centre of the table. We sat down. Mum at the head of the table. Emily and Ryan on either side. Me at the far end, the seat I'd always occupied, growing up, the spot farthest from the conversation, easiest to ignore. For the first 10 minutes, no one spoke to me. Emily launched into a detailed account of the trip, the resort, the beaches, the snorkeling excursion. Ryan added commentary about the food, the weather, the hotel amenities. Mum nodded along, asking questions, laughing at the right moments. I ate in silence, waiting. At the 32-minute mark I'd been counting, Emily paused to take a sip of water. The conversation lulled. I reached into my purse, which I'd set on the floor beside my chair, and pulled out the small Bluetooth speaker. I set it on the table between the candles. Emily stopped mid-sip. Ryan's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Mum's eyes locked on the speaker. "I found something while you were away," I said calmly. "I thought you'd want to hear it." "What is that?" Mum asked, her voice sharp. I didn't answer, I just pressed play. There was a brief moment of static, and then Dad's voice filled the room. "Margaret, I'm recording this because I need proof of my intentions. I know what you're planning, and I need you to understand that this is my decision made while I'm of sound mind. Promise me you won't change what we agreed on. Jessica gets her fair share, 33%, just like the others. She gave up everything to take care of me. She deserves this. Don't let your anger erase her. The effect was instantaneous. Mum's wine glass slipped from her hand. It hit the edge of her plate and tipped, sending red wine spilling across the white tablecloth like blood. Emily's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Ryan stared at Mum, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning realization. "What is he talking about?" Ryan said slowly. Mum lunged across the table, reaching for the speaker. "Turn that off." I picked it up calmly, holding it just out of her reach. "Sit down, Mum. Turn it off," she hissed, her voice venomous. "No," I said simply. She stood fully, now her chair scraping back. "This is my house. You don't get to sit down." I repeated, my voice still calm but edged with steel. "Or I'll play the rest of it right now and you'll hear exactly what else Dad had to say about you." She froze. Her hands were shaking. Her face had gone white beneath her tan. For the first time in my life, I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. She sat down slowly. I set the speaker back on the table but kept my hand on it. I looked at Ryan, then at Emily. Both of them were staring at Mum, now the questions forming on their faces. "There's more," I said quietly. "A lot more. Dad left recordings, documents, medical records. He knew what you were planning, Mum. He knew you'd try to cut me out of the will. So he made sure I'd have proof." "You're lying," Mum said, but her voice cracked. "Am I?" I reached into my purse again and pulled out a folded copy of the original will. I slid it across the table toward Ryan. "Read it." Ryan picked it up slowly, unfolding it. His eyes scanned the page. I watched his face change as he read the distribution clause. 33% to each of us, equal shares. "Mum," he said quietly, his voice strained. "What is this?" "It's fake," Mum snapped. "She's making this up. She's always been jealous." "It's notarized?" Ryan interrupted, his finger pointing to the stamp at the bottom. "And it's dated 2020. Ski. 4 years ago." Emily finally found her voice. "I don't understand. What's going on?" I looked directly at Mum. "Tell them." She didn't speak. She just stared at me with pure hatred. I picked up the speaker again. "Fine, I'll let Dad tell them." I pressed play on the second recording. Dad's voice, weaker this time, filled the room again. "If you're hearing this, it means Margaret went through with it. She changed the will. She erased Jessica. I couldn't stop her, but I could leave evidence. Jessica deserves her share. She gave up her career to take care of me. She's the only one who stayed. Don't let them tell you she doesn't matter. She's the best of all of us." The room was silent, except for the sound of Dad's laboured breathing on the recording. Then it stopped. I looked around the table. Ryan's face was pale, his jaw clenched. Emily was crying silently. And Mum sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. The dead can't speak, but their voice can still shatter the living. The silence that followed Dad's recording was thick and suffocating. I could hear the candles flickering, the distant hum of the refrigerator, Emily's quiet sniffling. Ryan was still staring at the will, his knuckles white as he gripped the paper. Mum hadn't moved, her eyes fixed on the speaker, like it was a loaded gun. I let the silence stretch. Let them sit in it. Let them feel the weight of what they'd just heard. Then I picked up my phone, scrolled to the next audio file, and looked directly at Mum. "There's more," I said quietly. "Don't." "Mum," said her voice low and dangerous. "Jessica, don't do this." "Do what?" I asked. "Tell the truth. Let them hear what Dad really thought, what he really knew." "You're tearing this family apart," she hissed. "No," I said, my voice steady. "You did that. I'm just making sure everyone knows it." I pressed play. Dad's voice returned weaker this time, raspier, like every word was a struggle. "Jess, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone and something went wrong. I need you to know what happened in these last few weeks. Last Tuesday, December 12th, your mother brought a notary to the house. I was barely conscious from the pain medication. My vision was blurry. I could hardly sit up. She put papers in front of me and told me to sign. I asked what they were. She said they were medical forms, insurance documents, but I saw the word will at the top of one page. I refused. Emily gasped softly. Ryan's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Dad's voice continued. She got angry. She said things I won't repeat here. But the worst part, the thing that broke my heart, was when she said, Robert Jessica doesn't care about you. She's just waiting for your money. She gave up that job because she had nothing else. You're her meal ticket. That's what your mother said about you, Jess. And it's a lie. You're the only one who loved me without condition. You're the only one who stayed. I watched the words land. Emily's hand flew to her mouth. Ryan's jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching. Mum's face had gone from white to red, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. She's lying, Mum said, but her voice was shaking now. He was confused. The medication didn't affect his cognition. I interrupted calmly. I reached into my purse and pulled out another document, the psychiatric evaluation from St. Mary's Hospital. I slid it across the table toward Ryan. This is from December the 15th, 3 days after the incident Dad described. It's a full mental competency assessment. Read the conclusion. Ryan picked it up with trembling hands. He read aloud, his voice hollow. Patient demonstrates full mental competency and decision-making capacity. No signs of cognitive impairment, confusion, or diminished mental function. Patient is fully capable of making legal and financial decisions. Emily looked at Mum, her tear-streaked face full of confusion and betrayal. Mum, what is he talking about? You tried to make Dad sign a new will when he was sick. I was protecting this family. Mum snapped, her composure finally cracking. Protecting it from her. She pointed at me, her finger shaking. She manipulated your father. She made him dependent on her so he'd feel guilty, so he'd give her everything. Stop, Ryan said quietly. Mum turned to him. Excuse me. Stop lying, Ryan said louder this time. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. I've listened to Dad's voice. I've read the medical records. I've seen the original will. And I've watched you sit there and call Jessica a liar when we both know. His voice broke. We both know she's the only one who was there. She gave up everything to take care of him, and you resented her for it. Sit down, Mum ordered, her voice cold and commanding, the tone she'd used our entire lives to shut down dissent. But Ryan didn't sit. For the first time in his life, my younger brother looked at our mother and said, No. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Mum's face twisted with rage. This is between me and her. Stay out of it. It's not between you and her, moi? Ryan shot back. It's about Dad. It's about his wishes. And you tried to erase them. He looked at me, his eyes red and glassy. Jess, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. I believed him. I could see it in his face, the shock, the guilt, the shame. Ryan had always been passive, always gone along with whatever Mum wanted because it was easier than fighting. But he wasn't cruel. He was just weak. I know, I said softly. Emily was still crying, her hands pressed against her face. I don't understand. Why would you do this, Mum? Why would you try to cut Jess out? Mum stood slowly, her hands braced against the table. She looked around at all of us, her face hard and brittle. Because she doesn't deserve it. She gave up one job. One. And she's held it over this family like a martyr ever since. Meanwhile, I've spent 40 years building this life, raising you, managing everything while your father worked himself to death. And what do I get? A daughter who swoop in at the end and plays nurse for 5 years. And suddenly she's a saint. She didn't swoop in, Ryan said, his voice tight with anger. She stayed. We didn't. I was in Seattle. Emily was busy with her kids. You were at book club. Jess was the one who drove him to every appointment, made sure he took his meds, sat with him when he couldn't sleep. Where were we, Mum? Where were you? Don't you dare. Where were you? Ryan shouted. Mum's face crumpled for just a second, a flash of something raw and painful before the mask slammed back into place. I was keeping this family together. I was protecting what your father and I built. By stealing from your own daughter, Ryan said, his voice breaking. It's not stealing, Mom spat. It's correcting a mistake. I stood slowly, picking up the speaker and my purse. It's not a mistake, Mom. It's fraud, and it's going to court. Mom's eyes went wide. You wouldn't. I already have, I said calmly. I met with Dad's attorney 3 days ago. We're filing a petition to invalidate the will you submitted and restore the original. We have the recordings, the medical records, and Father Thomas's testimony. You can fight it if you want, but you'll lose. Emily looked up at me, her face pale. Jess, please, don't do this. We can work it out. There's nothing to work out, I said. Dad made his wishes clear. I'm just making sure they're honoured. I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Ryan say quietly, She's right, Mum. You brought this on yourself. Mum's voice followed me down the hallway, shrill and desperate. If you do this, you're not welcome in this family ever again. I stopped at the front door and looked back. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, her face flushed, her hands balled into fists. I was never welcome, I said. That's the point. I walked out and closed the door behind me. Cracks don't break walls overnight. But once they start, nothing can stop them. 3 days after I walked out of Mum's house, I sat in Walter Adams's office and signed my name on a legal petition that would change everything. The office was small and cluttered, lined with law books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Walter himself was 71, retired from active practice, but sharp as ever, with white hair and reading glasses that perched on the end of his nose. He'd known Dad for 30 years, handled his business contracts, his real estate deals, his estate planning. And now he was handling this. Mark Reynolds sat across from me, a laptop open in front of him, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He was younger than I'd expected, 32, with dark hair and an intensity that made him seem like he never stopped working. In the past week, he'd traced every financial transaction related to the will, pulled records from the county clerk's office, interviewed 3 of Dad's doctors, and even tracked down the notary who'd allegedly witnessed the 2024 will signing. He'd built a case brick by brick. Walter slid the final document across the desk toward me. This is the petition. Once you sign it, there's no going back. Your mother will know within hours, and she will fight. I know, I said. She'll hire expensive lawyers. She'll try to discredit you publicly. She'll make this as painful as possible. I know, I repeated. Walter studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. Good. Then sign. I picked up the pen and signed Jessica Marie Parker. Walter countersigned as my attorney of record gathered the papers into a folder and handed them to Mark. File these at the courthouse by 3 p.m. I want this on the docket by tomorrow morning. Mark stood. On it. After he left, Walter poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher on his desk and handed me one. Your father would be proud of you. My throat tightened. I hope so. He is, Walter said firmly. He left you those recordings because he knew you'd have the courage to use them. Not everyone would. I took a sip of water, trying to steady myself. What happens next? Your mother will be served with a copy of the petition within 48 hours. She'll have 30 days to respond. In the meantime, the court will schedule a preliminary hearing to review the evidence and determine whether there's sufficient cause to proceed to trial. And if there is, then we go to trial Full probate court proceedings. You'll testify. I'll call Father Thomas the doctor's Ryan if he's willing. We'll present the recordings, the medical records, everything. And your mother's attorneys will try to tear it all apart. I nodded slowly. How long will it take? Months, maybe longer. Walter leaned back in his chair. Jessica, I need you to be prepared for what's coming. Your mother won't just fight this in court. She'll fight it everywhere. In the press, in your community, in your personal life. She'll paint you as greedy, opportunistic, vindictive. She'll make people believe you're the villain. Let her try, I said quietly. Walter smiled a small grim smile. That's the spirit. I wish I'd felt as confident as I sounded. The next morning, I woke to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. I sat up in bed at Aunt Mary's cabin, my phone buzzing non-stop in my hand. I scrolled through the messages, most from numbers I didn't recognise, a few from colleagues at school. One from a local journalist asking for comment. I opened the news app on my phone. The headline hit me like a fist to the stomach. Local teacher sues grieving mother over late father's estate. Family torn apart by greed. I clicked on the article. The first paragraph made my hand shake. Jessica Parker, 37, a high school English teacher in town, has filed a lawsuit against her mother, Margaret Parker, 65, contesting her late father's will. Sources close to the family say Parker is demanding a larger share of the estate, despite her father's clear wishes to leave the majority to his widow. Friends of Margaret Parker describe her as devastated and betrayed by her daughter's actions. I read it twice, my pulse pounding in my ears. Sources close to the family, friends of Margaret Parker. The article made me sound like a monster. My phone rang by Walter. Have you seen the news, Emma? I asked. I have, he said calmly. Don't engage, don't comment, don't respond to any journalists. This is exactly what I told you would happen. They're making me sound like I'm doing this for money, I said, my voice shaking. I know, and when we get to court, we'll show them the truth. But for now, let them write whatever they want. The only place it matters is in front of a judge. I hung up and sat on the edge of the bed staring at my phone. Over the next 2 hours, 3 more articles appeared. Each one painted me as the villain, greedy, selfish, ungrateful, a daughter exploiting her father's death for financial gain. By noon, I'd been tagged in 6 Facebook posts, all from people I barely knew, sharing the articles with comments like disgusting, and some people have no shame. When I went into school on Monday, the whispers started the moment I walked through the door. Colleagues I'd worked with for years avoided eye contact. One teacher I'd considered a friend walked past me in the hallway without saying hello. In the faculty lounge, conversation stopped when I entered. I poured a cup of coffee and left without speaking to anyone. That night, I was sitting at Aunt Mary's kitchen table staring at my laptop screen when someone knocked on the cabin door. Mary looked at me, eyebrows raised. You expecting someone? I shook my head. She walked to the door and peered through the window, then turned back to me. It's Ryan. My stomach dropped. What does he want? Only one way to find out. Mary opened the door. Ryan stood on the porch, hands shoved in his pockets, looking miserable. Hey, can I talk to Jess? Mary glanced at me. I nodded. Ryan stepped inside and Mary excused herself to the bedroom, leaving us alone. Ryan sat down across from me at the table, his face pale and drawn. I saw the articles, he said quietly. I'm sorry. I didn't respond. He ran a hand through his hair. Mom hired Gibson and Associates. They're the ones feeding stories to the press. She's paying them a fortune to destroy your reputation before this even gets to court. I figured, I said. Ryan looked down at his hands. Jess, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago. I waited. Mom made me lie, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. When she filed the new will, her lawyer asked if I'd witnessed Dad signing it. I said yes, but I didn't, I was never there. Mum told me to say I was. She said it was just a formality that Dad had wanted to change the will, but forgot to have witnesses present, so I was just confirming his intentions. And Diane, he looked up at me, his eyes red. I didn't know she was cutting you out completely. I swear I didn't, but I lied, and I'm sorry. I felt something crack open in my chest, anger, sadness, relief, all tangled together. Why are you telling me this now? Because it's the truth, he said, and because I can't keep lying for her, not anymore. I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. Will you testify to that in court? Ryan hesitated. I could see the fear in his eyes, fear of Mum, fear of the family falling apart, fear of being disowned. But then he nodded. Yes, he said. I'll testify. I exhaled slowly. Thank you. Ryan stood to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, Jess, I think Dad was right about you. You're stronger than any of us. After he left, I sat alone in the quiet cabin, staring at the documents spread across the table. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The courtroom is where lies go to die, and I had the truth on my side. Mark arrived at the cabin at 8 a.m., carrying his laptop and a thick manila folder. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, dark circles under his eyes, hair dishevelled, his shirt wrinkled, but there was an energy about him, a barely contained excitement. I found it, shit, he said before he'd even fully stepped through the door. Aunt Mary poured him coffee while I cleared space at the dining table. Walter was already there, having arrived an hour earlier to review motions. The three of us sat down while Mark opened his laptop and spread documents across the table. Okay, Mark said, taking a long sip of coffee. I've been digging into the will that your mother filed, the 24 version, the one that cuts you out completely. And, Walter prompted, it's not just fraudulent because your dad didn't sign it willingly. It's fraudulent because your mother built an entire false paper trail to support it. Mark pulled out a document and slid it toward me. This is a medical certificate signed by Dr. Helen Crane, dated December 18th, 23. It states that your father exhibited signs of dementia and diminished mental capacity, and that he was not competent to make legal decisions. I stared at the document. Dr. Crane's signature was at the bottom, bold and confident. Who is Dr. Helen Crane? I asked. That's the interesting part, Mark said. She's not your father's primary care physician. She's not a cardiologist. She's not even affiliated with St. Mary's Hospital, where your dad received all his actual treatment. She runs a small private practice on the other side of town, the kind of place that does wellness checks, travel vaccines, workers' comp evaluations. Low-level stuff. Walter leaned forward, his eyes sharp. So, how did she end up evaluating Robert's mental capacity? She didn't, Mark said flatly. Your father never saw her, not once. I checked her appointment logs, cross-referenced them with your dad's medical records from St. Mary's. There's no record of him ever setting foot in her clinic. My stomach dropped. She wrote a certificate for a patient she never examined. Exactly, Mark said. And here's where it gets worse. He pulled out another document, a bank statement. 2 days after Dr. Crane signed that certificate, she received a wire transfer for $15,000 from your mother. I felt the blood drain from my face. Mum paid her to lie. Not directly, Mark clarified. The transfer is listed as a consultation fee. But when I pulled Dr. Crane's financial records legally, through the subpoena Walter filed, I found email correspondence between her and an associate at her clinic. The emails reference a private arrangement with Margaret Parker discussing the certificate and the payment. Walter took the bank statement, studying it carefully. This is admissible if we can get Dr. Crane to testify. She'll fold, Mark said confidently. Her clinic's already under scrutiny from the State Medical Board for insurance fraud. She can't afford another investigation. I reached out to her attorney yesterday. He knows she's cornered, My guess is she'll cooperate in exchange for leniency. I sat back in my chair trying to process what I was hearing. Mum hadn't just changed the will. She'd fabricated medical evidence to justify it. She'd paid a doctor to lie about Dad's mental state, so no one would question her claim that he wasn't competent. "There's more," Mark said, and something in his tone made my skin prickle. He turned his laptop toward me and pressed play on a video. The footage was grainy shot from a high-angle security camera footage. The timestamp read March 3rd, 2024. The location tag said County Courthouse front steps. I watched myself walk down the courthouse steps after a meeting with Walter. I looked tired, distracted, my purse slung over one shoulder. Then a man approached me. He was in his 40s, wearing a cheap suit, holding a phone like he was recording. "Jessica Parker," he called out. I stopped and turned toward him. "Yes." "Your dad never loved you," the man said loudly, stepping closer. "He told me himself. You were a burden. He regretted letting you control his life." On the screen, I saw my face change, shock, then anger. "Who the hell are you?" "Just someone who knew the truth," the man sneered. "You're pathetic." I watched myself shove his shoulder, pushing him back. "Get away from me." The man stumbled dramatically, and the video cut off. Mark closed the laptop. That video was edited and posted online 6 hours later. It went viral. 2 million views in 24 hours. The headline was "Unstable Daughter Attacks Stranger at Courthouse." I remembered that day. I remembered the shame, the humiliation, the way people had stared at me afterward. The video had made me look unhinged, violent, dangerous. "I didn't attack him," I said quietly. "He was harassing me. He said horrible things about Dad." "I know," Mark said, "because I pulled the full security footage from the courthouse." He opened his laptop again and played a longer version of the video. This time the footage started 30 seconds earlier, showing the man waiting near the steps, checking his phone, clearly waiting for me. When I appeared, he immediately approached and started antagonizing me. The full context was clear. He'd been there specifically to provoke me. "This was planned," Walter said, his voice cold. "It was," Mark confirmed. I traced the man. His name is David Kowalski. He's an actor, mostly commercial work, a few bit parts in local theatre. 3 days before this incident, he received a payment of $3,000 from a PR consulting firm called Apex Media Solutions. "And who hired Apex Media Solutions?" I asked, though I already knew. Mark pulled up another document, a bank statement showing a transfer from an account in Emily's name. "Your sister. She paid Apex $15,000 to manage media strategy. When I contacted Apex's founder under the threat of legal action, he admitted that Emily hired them to create a narrative that you were emotionally unstable. The courthouse confrontation was staged to support that narrative." I felt sick. Emily, my own sister, had orchestrated a public attack designed to make me look like I was losing my mind. She'd hired an actor to provoke me, filmed it, edited it, to remove context, and spread it across the internet to destroy my credibility. "The consultant is willing to testify," Mark added. "He knows he could be charged with fraud, conspiracy, defamation. He's trying to save himself." Walter folded his hands on the table, his expression grim. "This changes everything. Margaret didn't just falsify a will. She paid a doctor to create fraudulent medical records. Emily orchestrated a defamation campaign using staged footage. This isn't just an estate dispute anymore. This is criminal." I looked at the documents spread across the table, the bank statements, the emails, the video footage, the medical certificates. It was all there. A carefully constructed web of lies, designed to erase me, discredit me, destroy me. "They didn't just lie about the will," I said slowly. "They built an entire false reality." Mark nodded. "And now we're going to tear it down." Walter stood, gathering the documents into a folder. I'm filing an emergency motion to present this evidence at the preliminary hearing. The judge needs to see this before we go any further. If Dr. Crane and the PR consultant testify, Margaret and Emily could be facing fraud charges, maybe even criminal conspiracy. I sat there staring at the evidence that would destroy my mother and sister. Part of me felt triumph, but another part, a small aching part, felt only sadness. They didn't just lie about the will, they built an entire false reality, and I was about to tear it down. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. I'd seen courtrooms on television, grand, imposing spaces with high ceilings and dramatic lighting. This was just a windowless room with fluorescent lights, wooden benches, and the faint smell of old paper and floor polish. But it was packed. Journalists lined the back row, notebooks open, cameras prohibited, but eyes recording everything. I saw familiar faces from town, former colleagues, neighbours, people I'd known my entire life, all here to watch the spectacle. And in the front row, on the opposite side of the room, sat Mum, Emily, and their attorney, Gregory Gibson, a man in his 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I sat behind Walter at the plaintiff's table, Aunt Mary beside me. Mark sat in the row behind us, his laptop open, ready to pull up documents at a moment's notice. My hands were shaking, so I gripped Dad's pocket watch in my lap, feeling the cool weight of it anchor me. Judge Eleanor Brooks entered through a side door and we all stood. She was a woman in her 60s with steel grey hair pulled into a tight bun, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and an expression that suggested she had no patience for nonsense. "Be seated," she said, her voice clipped and efficient. The bailiff called the case. In the matter of Parker estate petitioner, Jessica Marie Parker versus respondent Margaret Ann Parker. Judge Brooks looked down at the files in front of her, then up at both tables. This is a preliminary hearing to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed to trial regarding the contested will of Robert James Parker. Mr. Gibson, you may present your opening statement. Gibson stood buttoning his jacket and approached the bench with the confidence of a man who'd won 100 cases just like this one. Your Honour, he began, his voice smooth and practiced. This is a deeply unfortunate situation. A grieving widow trying to honour her late husband's final wishes is being attacked by her own daughter. A daughter motivated not by love or justice, but by greed. The will in question, dated January 2024, was executed lawfully, signed by Mr. Parker in the presence of witnesses, and filed appropriately with this court. Ms. Jessica Parker disputes this will not because it's invalid, but because she's unhappy with its contents. He paused, letting his words settle. The respondent, Mrs. Margaret Parker, has provided medical documentation proving that Mr. Parker's mental state was deteriorating in his final months, which explains certain inconsistencies the petitioner may try to exploit. But the facts are clear. Robert Parker made his wishes known. He chose to leave the majority of his estate to his wife, who stood by him for 40 years. To invalidate that will now would be a profound injustice. Gibson sat down. Judge Brooks turned to our table. Mr. Adams? Walter stood slowly, deliberately. He didn't rush to the bench, he simply clasped his hands behind his back and spoke in a calm, measured tone. Your Honour, the petitioner is not here out of greed. She's here because her father's voice has been silenced and she's the only one willing to speak for him. Robert Parker created a will in 2020, a will that was notarized legally sound and split his estate equally among his 3 children. That will was never revoked. Yet, in January 2024, after Mr. Parker's death, a new will mysteriously appeared, radically altering the distribution and conveniently excluding the one child who sacrificed everything to care for him. Walter's voice hardened. The respondent claims this new will reflects Mr. Parker's true wishes, but the evidence we will present today tells a very different story. A story of coercion, fabrication, and fraud. He sat down. For the next 2 hours, I watched as Gibson presented his case. He called a handwriting expert who testified that Dad's signature on the Tay 2024 will appeared genuine. He submitted the medical certificate from Dr. Crane, claiming it proved Dad's diminished capacity. He painted me as a daughter estranged from the family, bitter and vindictive. Then it was Walter's turn. He stood and methodically dismantled every piece of Gibson's argument. First, he presented the original 2020 will, walking the judge through its clear language, its notarization, its legal validity. Then he presented the medical records from St. Mary's Hospital, dozens of pages documenting Dad's treatment from 2018 until his death. Your Honour, Walter said, holding up the psychiatric evaluation. This assessment was conducted on December the 15th, 23, just 10 days before Mr. Parker's death. It explicitly states that he was mentally competent with no signs of cognitive impairment. Yet Dr. Crane's certificate dated 3 days later claims the opposite. He paused, letting that sink in. Dr. Crane never treated Mr. Parker. She never examined him. And 2 days after signing this certificate, she received $15,000 from Margaret Parker. Walter handed the bank statement to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Brooks. The judge studied it in silence, her expression unreadable. Walter continued, "We also have email correspondence obtained through subpoena between Dr. Crane and an associate discussing this so-called consultation fee." He submitted the emails. The courtroom was silent except for the rustling of paper. Then, Walter played Dad's recording. The sound of Dad's voice filled the courtroom, weak, strained, but unmistakably clear. I watched Mum's face as he spoke. She stared straight ahead, jaw-clenched hands gripping the armrests of her chair. When the recording ended, Walter said quietly, "That is Robert Parker's voice recorded 3 weeks before his death, explicitly stating his intentions and warning that his wife was trying to coerce him into changing his will." Finally, Walter addressed the viral video. He played the edited version first, the one that made me look violent and unstable. Then he played the full courthouse security footage, showing the man approaching me, antagonizing me, clearly staged. "This man," Walter said, pulling up a photo of David Kowalski, "was paid $3,000 by a PR firm hired by Emily Parker to provoke Ms. Jessica Parker on camera. The goal was to make her appear emotionally unfit, to discredit her before this hearing. The PR consultant has agreed to testify to that effect." Gibson objected several times, his voice rising, but Judge Brooks overruled him each time. Then Walter turned to me. "Your Honour, I'd like to call Jessica Parker to the stand." My heart stopped. We'd discussed this possibility, but I hadn't been certain it would happen. I stood my legs shaking and walked to the witness stand. The bailiff swore me in, and I sat down, gripping Dad's pocket watch in my lap beneath the edge of the stand where no one could see. Walter approached. "Ms. Parker, can you tell the court why you're here today?" I took a breath, looked directly at Judge Brooks and spoke. "I'm here because my father asked me to be. He left me a letter recording evidence, not because he wanted me to fight with my family, but because he knew they'd try to erase me. And he was right." My voice was steady calm. "At my parents' 40th anniversary, my mother told me in front of 80 people that I wasn't part of the family. She was right about one thing. A family built on lies isn't mine anymore. But the truth, my father's truth, that's something no one can erase." I held up the pocket watch briefly. This was my father's. He gave it to me the last Christmas we spent together. He said I was the only one who still showed up on time for family, the only one who still showed up at all. I looked at Mum, then directly across the courtroom. Her face was stone. "I'm not here for money. I'm here because my father deserves to be heard. And I'm the only one left who's willing to listen." Walter nodded. "No further questions, Your Honour." Gibson declined to cross-examine. Judge Brooks sat in silence for a long moment, reviewing documents, rereading notes. Finally, she looked up. "The court, I bore sufficient prima facie evidence of potential fraud, coercion, and falsification of medical records. Dr. Helen Crane is hereby ordered to appear and provide testimony within 30 days. Additionally, I am ordering a full financial audit of all transactions related to the estate and the filing of the 24 will. She looked directly at Mum's attorney. Mr. Gibson, I suggest your client cooperate fully. This hearing is continued pending further investigation. We will reconvene in 30 days. She struck her gavel. I exhaled my entire body, sagging with relief. Walter put a hand on my shoulder. You did well. As we stood to leave, I glanced back at Mum. She was staring at me, her expression unreadable. Emily looked stricken, and for just a moment I felt something almost like pity. But only for a moment. I won the battle, but the war was just beginning. The drive back to the cabin felt endless. Aunt Mary kept the radio off, respecting my silence, but I could feel her worried glances every few minutes. When we finally pulled into the gravel driveway, she squeezed my hand. You did the right thing in there, she said. I nodded, but couldn't find words. I climbed out of the car, went straight to the guest room and closed the door. For an hour, I just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. My phone buzzed with messages. Congratulations from Walter, updates from Mark. A text from a former colleague I hadn't heard from in months saying she'd seen the news and was proud of me. I didn't respond to any of them. I kept seeing Mum's face, the way her jaw had tightened when Dad's recording played, the way her hands had gripped the armrests when Walter presented the wire transfer to Dr. Crane, the way she'd looked at me as I left the courtroom, not with hatred, but with something worse. Defeat. I'd won. Judge Brooks had sided with me, ordered an investigation, basically declared that Mom's case was built on fraud. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated, free. Instead, I felt sick. Around 8 p.m, my phone rang. Ryan. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Jess, he said, his voice tight. Mom's in the hospital. My stomach dropped. What happened? After the hearing, she collapsed in the parking lot. Blood pressure spiked. They're keeping her overnight for observation. He paused. Emily's here, I'm here. It's bad, Jess. Is she okay? Physically, yeah, but... He trailed off. She's not talking. She just stares at the wall. I've never seen her like this. I closed my eyes. I didn't want this. I know, Ryan said quietly. But it's happening anyway. After we hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand staring at the screen. Part of me wanted to drive to the hospital to see her to say something what I didn't know, but another part of me knew that showing up would only make things worse. I tried to sleep but couldn't. At midnight, I gave up and called Mark. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. Jess, you okay? No, I said, and my voice broke. I'm not okay. What's wrong? What happened? The words came tumbling out fast and desperate. I just wanted them to love me, Mark. That's all I ever wanted. And now I'm destroying them. Mum's in the hospital because of me. Emily's probably losing her mind. Ryan's caught in the middle. I've torn this family apart, and for what? Money. A piece of paper that says I'm worth 33% instead of 0. My voice cracked. Was it worth it? Mark was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, steady. Jess, you're not destroying them. They destroyed themselves. You're just refusing to be destroyed with them. It doesn't feel like that, I whispered. It feels like I'm the one wielding the knife. No, Mark said firmly. You're the one holding up a mirror. They don't like what they see, so they're calling it destruction, but it's not. It's truth. And truth is the only thing that can actually heal this. I don't know if I believe that anymore. You don't have to believe it tonight, Mark said. Just don't give up. Not when you've come this far. We talked for another 20 minutes, and slowly the tightness in my chest began to ease. By the time we hung up, I still felt exhausted, but the spiral had stopped. I finally fell asleep around 2 a.m. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I looked out the window and saw Ryan's truck. My first thought was panic, something's happened to Mum. But when he got out, his face wasn't panicked. Just tired and sad. I met him at the door. Is she okay? They discharged her this morning, Ryan said. She's home. Emily's staying with her. Then what are you doing here? Ryan shoved his hands in his pockets. I needed to see you, to tell you something. I led him inside. Aunt Mary was in the kitchen and she quietly excused herself, sensing this was private. Ryan and I sat at the dining table, the same table where Mark had spread evidence just days ago. I've been thinking about what happened in court, Ryan began. About everything you said, about Dad's recordings, about the lies. He looked down at his hands. I've spent my whole life going along with what Mum wanted because it was easier, because standing up to her meant risking everything. But watching you up there on that stand holding Dad's watch telling the truth, even though it's destroying you. He looked up, his eyes red. I realised I've been a coward. Ryan, no, let me finish, he said. When we go back to court, when they call witnesses, I'm testifying. I'm telling the judge that Mum made me lie about witnessing Dad's signature. I'm telling them everything I know. I stared at him. You know what that means, right? She'll never forgive you. I know, Ryan said, his voice breaking. But I can't keep lying for her. Not after what I saw her do to you, not after what I heard in Dad's voice. He reached across the table and took my hand. I'm done being part of her lies, Jess. I'm done. I felt tears spill down my cheeks. I stood and Ryan stood with me and I hugged him tightly. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I had family. Real family. Not the performance version, but the kind built on truth and choice. Thank you, I whispered into his shoulder. When he pulled back, he wiped his own eyes. I should go. Emily's probably wondering where I am. Will you be okay? I asked. He gave me a sad smile. I don't know, but at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. After he left, I stood on the porch watching his truck disappear down the road. Aunt Mary came out and stood beside me, her arm around my shoulders. That took courage, she said, for both of you. I nodded. The morning was cold, the sky overcast, the lake grey and still. Everything felt raw and painful, like the world had been scraped down to its bones. But there was something else too. Something small but undeniable. Hope. Sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to cut deeper first. The law office, where we met Dr. Crane, was sterile and impersonal glass walls, grey carpets, modern furniture that looked expensive but uncomfortable. Walter, Mark and I arrived 15 minutes early and were shown into a conference room on the 3rd floor. Through the window, I could see the town below, small and distant. Mark set up his laptop and arranged documents on the table. Bank statements, emails, timelines, all the evidence that had taken him weeks to compile. Walter reviewed his notes, his reading glasses perched on his nose. I sat in silence, my hands folded in my lap trying to steady my breathing. At exactly 10 a.m. the door opened. Dr. Helen Crane walked in, followed by a man in his 40s wearing a rumpled suit, her attorney, I assumed. Dr. Crane looked nothing like I'd imagined. She was in her early 50s with short brown hair starting to grey, tired eyes, and a nervous energy that made her seem smaller than she was. She wore a plain blouse and slacks, no jewellery, no makeup. She looked like someone who hadn't slept well in months. Her attorney introduced himself as Paul Hendricks. We shook hands, everyone sat, and the room fell into tense silence. Walter spoke first, his tone measured and professional. Dr. Crane, thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I want to be clear about why we're here. You signed a medical certificate on December 18, 2023, stating that Robert Parker exhibited signs of dementia and diminished mental capacity. That certificate was used to support a will that has since been contested. We have reason to believe the certificate was fraudulent. Dr. Crane's hands trembled slightly. She glanced at her attorney, who nodded for her to listen. Walter continued. We also have evidence of a financial transaction between you and Margaret Parker 15 $15,000 transferred 2 days after you signed the certificate, and we have email correspondence discussing that payment." He slid copies of the documents across the table. "We're here to give you an opportunity to cooperate. If you testify truthfully about what happened, we can work with the court to seek leniency. If you don't, you'll face criminal charges for fraud, falsifying medical records, and possibly conspiracy." Dr. Crane stared at the documents, her face pale. Hendricks leaned over and whispered something in her ear. She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't want to do it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then tell us what happened," Walter said gently. Dr. Crane took a shaky breath. "Margaret Parker called my office in December. She said her husband was dying and she needed documentation of his mental state for legal purposes. She asked if I could conduct an evaluation. I told her he'd need to come to my clinic, but she said he was too weak to travel. She offered to pay me for a home visit." "Did you go to the home?" Mark asked. Dr. Crane shook her head. "No. She called me back the next day and said he'd deteriorated too quickly, that he couldn't be evaluated anymore. But she still needed the paperwork. She said all the family knew he'd been confused in his final weeks, and she just needed a doctor to confirm it for the will. She said it was a formality." "And you agreed?" Walter said. Dr. Crane's voice cracked. "She offered me $15,000. My practice is drowning in debt. I'm behind on my lease, my malpractice insurance, everything. I thought no one would check. I thought it was just paperwork." "You never examined Robert Parker," Mark said, his voice hard. "No." Dr. Crane admitted, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I never met him. I wrote the certificate based on what Margaret told me. She said he'd been showing signs of dementia for months, that his other doctors had noticed it, but hadn't documented it officially. She made it sound legitimate. "But you knew it wasn't," I said, unable to stay silent any longer. My voice was cold, controlled. "You knew you were lying." Dr. Crane looked at me for the first time, and I saw shame in her eyes. "Yes, I knew." "My father was lucid," I continued. "He was competent. He had full capacity to make decisions. And you signed a document saying otherwise so my mother could steal his estate from me." "I'm sorry," Dr. Crane whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix what you did," I said. Hendricks cleared his throat. "Dr. Crane is prepared to testify to everything she just told you. She'll provide a full written statement, appear in court, and cooperate completely with any investigation. In exchange, we're asking that the court consider her cooperation when determining penalties." Walter looked at Mark, who nodded. Then Walter turned back to Hendricks. "We'll take that to the judge. But Dr. Crane needs to understand if she changes her story, if she tries to backtrack or minimize what she did, the deal is off." "She understands," Hendricks said. Dr. Crane nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'll tell the truth. All of it." Walter pulled out a portable recording device. "Then let's start now. I want a recorded statement." For the next 45 minutes, Dr. Crane repeated her confession in detail, how Margaret had contacted her, what Margaret had said, how much she'd been paid, and how she'd written the certificate without ever examining my father. Hendricks recorded the statement on his phone as well, creating a backup. By the end, Dr. Crane was sobbing openly, apologizing over and over. I felt no sympathy, only cold satisfaction. When we finished, Walter gathered the documents and stood. "We'll file this with the court today. You'll receive a summons for the trial date. Be prepared to testify exactly as you did here." Dr. Crane nodded weakly. As we left the office, I glanced back one last time. She was sitting with her head in her hands, her attorney beside her looking like a woman who'd just destroyed her own life. Outside, the three of us stood in the parking lot. Mark closed his laptop and exhaled sharply. "That was easier than I expected." "She was desperate," Walter said. "Desperate people fold quickly when they're cornered. I looked at both of them. What happens now? Walter checked his watch. Now I file an emergency motion to admit her confession into evidence. I'll also request an expedited trial date. With her testimony, Margaret's entire case collapses. The judge will see that the medical certificate was fabricated, which means the 2024 will has no legitimacy. How long until trial? I asked. 30 days, maybe less, if the judge agrees to expedite. Mark put a hand on my shoulder. Jess, this is it. This is the evidence that wins the case. Dr. Crane was the linchpin of your mother's defence. Without her, they have nothing. I nodded slowly, letting it sink in. For months, I'd been fighting an uphill battle, wondering if I'd ever have enough proof, enough credibility, enough strength to win. And now, suddenly, the tide had turned. The lie that held their case together just confessed. Now, nothing could save them. The courtroom was more crowded than it had been for the preliminary hearing. Every seat in the gallery was filled with journalists, townspeople, distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. The air felt thick with anticipation, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the spectacle to begin. I sat at the plaintiff's table between Walter and Mark. Behind me, Aunt Mary sat in the front row, her hand resting on my shoulder until the bailiff told everyone to take their seats. And, behind her, in a gesture that still made my throat tight, sat Ryan. He'd driven 2 hours to be here, knowing full well what his testimony would cost him. Across the aisle, Mum sat beside Gregory Gibson, her posture rigid, her face pale and drawn. She'd aged in the past 5 months, new lines around her mouth, grey roots showing in her hair, a hollowness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Emily sat beside her, staring at her lap, refusing to look at anyone. She looked small, diminished, like someone who'd been carrying a weight too heavy for too long. Judge Brooks entered, and we all stood. She settled into her chair, surveyed the courtroom with those sharp, assessing eyes, and nodded to the bailiff. Be seated. This court is now in session. In the matter of Parker Estate, we will hear final testimony and arguments before rendering a verdict. Gibson stood first. His opening statement was shorter this time, more defensive. He argued that Margaret had acted in good faith, that any irregularities were honest mistakes, that Jessica was exploiting tragic circumstances for personal gain. But his voice lacked the confidence it had carried during the preliminary hearing. He knew he was losing. Then it was Walter's turn. He stood slowly, clasped his hands, and spoke with quiet authority. Your Honour, the evidence will show that Margaret Parker orchestrated a deliberate campaign to defraud her late husband's estate. She coerced a physician into falsifying medical records. She pressured her son into lying under oath. She enabled her daughter's defamation campaign. This isn't a family dispute. This is fraud. And Robert Parker left us his voice so we'd know the truth. Walter sat down. Judge Brooks looked at the witness list. Call your first witness, Mr. Adams. The petitioner calls Ryan Parker. Ryan stood, walked to the witness stand, and was sworn in. His hands were shaking as he sat down. He looked at me once briefly, and I nodded. You can do this. Walter approached. Mr. Parker, you previously provided testimony to your mother's attorneys, stating that you witnessed your father willingly sign a new will in January 2024. Is that correct? Yes, Ryan said quietly. Was that testimony true? Ryan's voice broke. No, it wasn't. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Brooks raised a hand and silence fell. Can you explain what really happened? Walter asked. Ryan took a breath. My mother called me in February after Dad died. She said there was some confusion about the will, and she needed me to confirm that Dad had signed a new version. She told me it was just a formality, that I was just verifying Dad's intentions. I didn't know she'd cut Jessica out entirely. I didn't know it was fraud. I lied because... His voice cracked. Because I was scared of her. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. Gibson cross-examined aggressively, trying to suggest Ryan was lying now to protect me. But Ryan held firm. By the time he stepped down, the damage was done. Next, Dr. Crane took the stand. She looked even worse than she had during our meeting, pale, thin eyes red from crying. She testified in a shaking voice, admitting everything. The $15,000 payment, the falsified certificate, the fact that she'd never examined my father. "I deeply regret my actions," she said, her voice barely audible. "Robert Parker deserved better. His family deserved better. I lied in my report and I'm ashamed." Gibson tried to attack her credibility, but it was futile. She had nothing left to lose. She'd already destroyed her own career. All she could do now was tell the truth. Then, Mark presented the courthouse footage and the testimony from the PR consultant, who confirmed under oath that Emily had hired him to stage the confrontation. Emily's face crumpled as the video played, showing the man provoking me, showing the setup, showing the lie. Finally, Walter played Dad's recording one last time. His voice filled the courtroom, weak-laboured but undeniably clear. I watched the faces in the gallery as he spoke. Some people cried, others shook their heads in disbelief, and Mum sat motionless, staring straight ahead, her jaw clenched so tight I thought it might crack. When the recording ended, the courtroom was silent. Judge Brooks looked at me. "Ms. Parker, would you like to make a statement before I render my verdict?" I stood slowly. Walter had offered to write something for me, but I'd refused. These words needed to be mine. I walked to the podium, looked directly at Judge Brooks and spoke. "Your Honour, I don't hate my mother. I don't even hate Emily. I hate what fear made them become. My father loved all of us equally. He wanted fairness, not conflict. He didn't want us standing in this courtroom. But he also didn't want me erased." I paused, my voice steady. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because my father asked me to be. He left me his voice because he knew I'd have the courage to speak when he couldn't. That's all I've done. I've spoken his truth, and now I'm asking this court to honour it." I sat down. Judge Brooks reviewed her notes for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she looked up. "Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that the will, dated January 2024, was procured through fraud, coercion, and falsification of medical records. The will, dated March 2020, is hereby restored as the valid and enforceable last will and testament of Robert James Parker." I exhaled, my entire body sagging with relief. Judge Brooks continued. "Margaret Parker is ordered to reimburse Jessica Parker for all legal expenses incurred in this matter. Emily Parker will be subject to a separate civil investigation regarding her role in the defamation campaign. And Sir Helen Crane's medical licence is suspended pending review by the State Medical Board." "And so," she struck her gavel, "this court is adjourned." The courtroom erupted in noise, journalists scrambling for their exits, people whispering, chairs scraping. I sat frozen, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. Walter put a hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Jess?" I looked across the aisle. Mum was still sitting motionless, staring at nothing. Emily was crying quietly into her hands. And then Ryan stood, walked across the aisle and pulled me into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry for everything," he whispered. "I know," I said. As people filed out of the courtroom, I stood there holding Dad's pocket watch in my hand, feeling the weight of what I'd done. I won, but winning never felt so lonely. The week after the trial passed, in a strange, suspended quiet, I stayed at Aunt Mary's cabin watching the days blur together, unable to summon the energy to do much of anything. Walter called twice to update me on the settlement process. Mark sent a congratulatory text. A few former colleagues reached out tentatively, as if testing whether I'd gone back to being approachable now that the drama was over. But mostly I was alone with my thoughts, and they were darker than I'd expected. On the 8th day, Ryan called. "Have you heard from Mum?" he asked. "No. Why?" He sighed. "She hasn't left the house since the verdict. I went by yesterday to check on her. She didn't answer the door, but I saw her through the window. She was just sitting in Dad's old chair, staring at nothing." My chest tightened. Is she okay? I don't know, Ryan admitted. Her friends from the country club have stopped calling. I ran into Barbara Henderson at the grocery store and she pretended she didn't see me. It's like the whole town has turned their backs on her. That's what happens when you build your life on lies, I said, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. Yeah, Ryan said quietly. I guess. After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone for a long time. I told myself I shouldn't care. She'd tried to erase me. She'd hired a doctor to lie, pressured Ryan to commit perjury, enabled Emily's defamation campaign. She deserved every consequence she was facing. But I couldn't shake the image Ryan had described. Mum sitting alone in Dad's chair, abandoned by everyone. 2 days later, Ryan called again. Emily's gone, he said. Gone where? California. She packed up her stuff, left her husband with the kids, and moved. She didn't tell anyone where exactly. She deleted all her social media. I tried calling, but her number's disconnected. I felt something twist in my chest. She just left. She can't face what she did, Ryan said. She can't face? You can't face Mum, can't face herself. So she ran. I thought about Emily, my sister who'd once been my playmate, my confidant before Mum taught her I was less than. I thought about the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become, and I felt something I didn't expect. Sadness, not satisfaction, not vindication, just a deep, aching sadness for everything we'd lost. That same week, something else started happening. Letters began arriving at Aunt Mary's cabin, forwarded from my old apartment, from the school, from addresses I didn't recognise. At first, there were a few, then dozens, then hundreds. They were from women. Women who'd been erased by their families. Women who'd been written out of wills, gaslit, dismissed, forgotten. Women who'd read about my case in the newspaper or seen the courtroom footage online. One letter, handwritten on lined notebook paper, read, Dear Jessica, I'm 63 years old. My father died 5 years ago and left everything to my brother, even though I was the one who took care of him for a decade. I never fought it because I thought it would make me look greedy. But reading your story gave me courage. I'm filing a case next month. Thank you for showing me I'm not alone. Another typed and printed said, You don't know me, but I want you to know you saved my life. I've spent 40 years being invisible in my own family. Your story made me realise I'm not crazy. I'm not the problem. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for winning. I read them late at night, sitting at the kitchen table, tears streaming down my face. Each letter felt like a piece of my own story reflected back at me. These women understood. They'd lived it. And somehow my fight had become theirs. On the 10th day, I drove to the cemetery. It was a grey afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. I walked up the hill to Dad's grave carrying a bouquet of white roses, the same kind he used to grow in the backyard. I knelt in the grass and placed the flowers against the headstone. The engraving was simple. Robert James Parker, beloved father. The stone was cold under my fingers. I pulled out a small notebook I'd been carrying in my purse and opened it to a blank page. I wrote, Dad, I did it. I kept my promise. I found your voice. I spoke your truth. The judge ruled in my favour. The 2020 will is restored. You were heard. I paused, the pen trembling in my hand. But I wish you were here to tell me it was worth it. Because right now, it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like losing everyone all over again. Mum won't leave her house. Emily ran away to California. Ryan's caught in the middle, trying to hold what's left of the family together. And I'm here alone, wondering if fighting for the truth was worth destroying everything else. I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest, closing my eyes. The wind picked up rustling the oak tree above me. For a moment, I let myself imagine Dad's voice, steady, calm, certain, telling me I'd done the right thing. Telling me it would get easier. Telling me I was free now, even if it didn't feel like it yet. But all I heard was the wind. I stayed there for an hour, sitting in the grass, talking to him, in my head telling him about the letters, about Ryan's testimony, about the moment the judge struck her gavel, and everything changed. Finally, I brushed the dirt from my jeans, and walked back to my car. As I drove back to the cabin, I thought about what came next. The estate would be settled. I'd receive my third. I'd have enough money to start over, to leave this town, to build a life somewhere no one knew my name or my story. But I didn't know if I wanted to leave. This place, for all its pain, was still the only home I'd ever known. When I got back to the cabin, Aunt Mary was making soup. The smell filled the small space, warm, comforting, grounding. She looked up when I walked in. "You okay?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. She nodded as if that was answer enough and handed me a bowl. We ate in silence, the only sound the clink of spoons against ceramic and the distant hum of the lake beyond the windows. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the past 5 months in my mind. The anniversary party, the letter from Dad, the church basement, the courtroom, the verdict. I'd won, I'd proven the truth, I'd honoured Dad's wishes. But the cost was everything I'd once desperately wanted, a family that loved me. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. Then, 3 days later, Mum called. She wanted to see me one last time. Ryan's voice on the phone was tight with panic. "Jess, you need to come. Mom had a stroke. She's at St. Mary's. She's asking for you." I sat frozen at Aunt Mary's kitchen table, my phone pressed to my ear, not sure I'd heard him correctly. "She's asking for me." "Yes," Ryan said. "She keeps saying your name. The doctors say she's stable, but..." His voice cracked. "I don't know how much time she has. Please, Jess, just come." I looked at Aunt Mary, who was watching me with concern. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, and hung up. The drive to the hospital was a blur. My mind raced with 1,000 conflicting emotions: anger, fear, guilt, exhaustion. Part of me wanted to turn the car around, to refuse to give her this final confrontation. She'd spent 37 years making me feel invisible. Why should I show up now when she was finally vulnerable? But I kept driving. St. Mary's Hospital looked the same as it had during Dad's countless visits: sterile, fluorescent lit, smelling of antiseptic and anxiety. I parked in the visitors' lot and walked through the automatic doors, past the reception desk, toward the elevator. Ryan had texted me the room number, 412. When I stepped off the elevator on the 4th floor, I saw Ryan standing in the hallway outside her room. He looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed, his shirt wrinkled like he'd been wearing it for days. "She's awake," he said quietly. "She's been asking for you every hour since they brought her in." "How bad is it?" I asked. "The doctors say she's stable, but the stroke was significant. They don't know if there will be lasting damage. She can speak, but it's difficult for her." I nodded and looked at the closed door to room 412. "Is anyone else in there?" "No, just her. Emily's..." He trailed off. "Emily's not coming back." I took a breath, steadied myself and pushed open the door. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of monitors and a small lamp beside the bed. Mum lay propped up on pillows, an IV in her arm, oxygen tubing under her nose. She looked so small, so frail. The commanding cold woman who'd ruled our family with an iron grip was gone, replaced by someone fragile and human and breakable. When she saw me, her face crumpled. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she made a sound, half sob, half gasp. "Jess," she whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. I walked slowly to the bedside, my heart pounding. I didn't sit. I just stood there looking down at her, waiting. "I'm sorry," she said, the words barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I was wrong about everything." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat was too tight. She reached out a trembling hand toward me, and after a long moment I took it. Her skin was cold, papery, fragile. "Sit," she whispered. Please." I pulled a chair close to the bed and sat still, holding her hand, feeling the weak grip of her fingers around mine. "I need to tell you something," she said, her words slow and laboured. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." "What?" I asked quietly. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering strength, then opened them again. "When I was young, I was the forgotten daughter too." I stared at her. "My father left my mother when I was 12. She continued, her voice shaking. "He married a younger woman, someone beautiful, charming, everything my mother wasn't. They had children together. And when my father died, his new wife made sure my mother and I got nothing. She changed his will. She painted us as bitter, greedy, ungrateful, and everyone believed her." My stomach twisted. "Mum!" "I spent my whole life afraid of being abandoned again." She interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "I married your father because he was stable, dependable. He promised he'd never leave. And for 40 years I held onto him so tightly, I suffocated him. I suffocated all of you." She paused, struggling to breathe, and I squeezed her hand gently. "When I saw how much your father loved you," she whispered, "when I saw how much time you spent with him, how he looked at you like you were the best thing he'd ever made, I thought it meant he loved me less. I thought you were taking him away from me the way that other woman took my father." Her voice broke completely. "I was wrong, Jess. You weren't taking him. You were loving him the way I should have. And I punished you for it because I was terrified that if he loved you too much, there wouldn't be any love left for me." I felt tears streaming down my own face now. "I never wanted to take him from you, Mum. I just wanted you to see me." "I see you now," she whispered, her grip tightening weakly around my hand. "I see you, Jess. And I'm so sorry it took me this long." We sat in silence, her hand in mine, both of us crying quietly. The monitors beeped steadily in the background. The hospital hummed with distant voices and footsteps. "Why did you try to cut me out of the will, so?" I asked finally, my voice raw. She closed her eyes. "Because I thought if I erased you from his estate, I could erase the guilt. I could pretend I hadn't spent 40 years being the wrong kind of wife, the wrong kind of mother, but all I did was prove that I was exactly what I feared, just like my father's second wife. Cruel, selfish, afraid." "You hurt me," I said quietly. "For my entire life, you hurt me." "I know," she whispered, "and I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know. It was never about you. It was always about me. My fear, my brokenness. You didn't deserve any of it." I sat there holding her hand, feeling the weight of 37 years of pain and longing and rejection slowly beginning to shift. Not disappear, but shift. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly. "Not yet." "I know," she said. "I don't deserve it. But I don't want to hate you anymore." I continued, my voice breaking. "I'm so tired of hating you." She squeezed my hand one more time, her eyes closing. "Then don't. Let me go, Jess. You've carried me long enough." Her breathing steadied. The monitors beeped rhythmically. And I sat beside her, holding her hand until the nurses came in for their rounds and asked me quietly if I needed anything. I shook my head. I stayed for 3 more hours sitting in that chair watching her sleep, feeling something inside me begin to loosen. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the beginning of release. When I finally left, Ryan was still in the hallway. "How is she?" "Resting," I said. "She told me a lot." He nodded. "She told me too. About her father. About why she did what she did." We stood together in silence for a moment, 2 siblings trying to figure out how to hold the shattered pieces of a family that had never been whole. "I'll come back tomorrow," I said. But I didn't get the chance. 3 days later, she was gone, and I never got to tell her I forgave her. The funeral was held on a grey Thursday morning, at St. Michael's Church, the same place where Dad's service had been held 6 months earlier. The attendance was sparse, maybe 20 people. Ryan and I sat in the front pew. Emily arrived late, slipping into a back row, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. Father Thomas led the service. He spoke about mercy, about the difficulty of forgiveness, about the hope that even broken people can find peace in the end. His words were kind but vague. He hadn't known Mum well, and there wasn't much to say about a woman who'd spent her life building walls instead of bridges. No one cried. There were no eulogies. Just a brief prayer, a hymn, and then it was over. We buried her beside Dad under the oak tree on the hill. I stood between Ryan and Aunt Mary, staring at the casket as it was lowered into the ground. Emily stood 15 feet away, arms crossed, looking like she wanted to disappear. When the graveside service ended, she turned and walked back to her rental car without a word. Ryan watched her go, his face tight with sadness. She can't even stay an hour. Let her go, I said quietly. She's not ready. Will she ever be? I didn't have an answer. After the funeral, people drifted away, distant cousins, a few neighbours, Mum's former book club president who'd shown up out of obligation. Soon, it was just Ryan, Aunt Mary and me standing in the parking lot. What happens now? Ryan asked. We go through the house, I said. Figure out what to keep, what to donate, what to sell. He nodded. When? Whenever you're ready. He looked at me with tired, red-rimmed eyes. How about next week? Next week. I agreed. A week later, I drove to my childhood home. Ryan was already there, parked in the driveway, sitting in his truck with the engine off. When he saw me, he got out and we walked to the front door together. The house smelled stale, like old air and dust and absence. We moved through the rooms methodically, sorting items into boxes, keep, donate, trash. Most of it was trash. Old magazines, broken picture frames, drawers full of receipts and expired coupons. The physical remnants of a life that had looked perfect from the outside but had been hollow at the centre. By mid-afternoon, we'd cleared most of the living room and kitchen. Ryan suggested we take a break, so I wandered toward the back door and stepped outside. The backyard was worse than I'd imagined. The grass had grown waist-high, wild and tangled. The flower beds Dad had once meticulously maintained were choked with weeds. The wooden fence sagged. Everything looked abandoned, forgotten, left to rot. I walked slowly through the overgrowth, pushing aside tall grass until I reached what had once been Mum's garden, a small plot near the back fence where she used to grow roses and hydrangeas. Now it was a mess of brambles and dead stems. And then I saw it. Half buried in the weeds, leaning crookedly against a fence post, was a small wooden sign. The paint was faded, the wood weathered and cracked, but the words were still legible, carved in careful script. To Jessica, the daughter I never knew how to love. Mum, 2019. I dropped to my knees in the dirt. 2009, 5 years ago. Long before the will, before the lawsuit, before everything fell apart. She'd made this sign and planted it here, hidden in a garden. No one visited where no one would see it. She'd known. Even then, she'd known she'd failed me. And she'd written it down, carved it into wood, left it here like a confession she couldn't speak aloud. I pressed my hands against the sign, feeling the rough wood under my fingers, and I cried. Not the silent, controlled tears I'd shed at the hospital or the funeral, but deep, wrenching sobs that tore through me like a storm. I cried for the mother I'd never had, for the daughter I'd tried so hard to be, for all the years we'd wasted hating each other when we were both just terrified, broken women who didn't know how to bridge the distance between us. I cried until I had nothing left. Then I stood, wiped my face, and looked around the ruined garden. And I made a decision. I went back into the house and found Ryan in the kitchen. Do you have gardening tools? Gloves, a shovel? He looked at me confused. In the garage? Why, I'm going to fix the garden. He didn't ask questions. He just helped me carry the tools outside. For the next 2 hours, I worked. I pulled weeds, cleared dead plants, loosened the soil with a spade. Ryan watched for a while, then joined me, and together we transformed the overgrown mess into something clean and open. When the plot was cleared, I drove to the garden centre downtown and bought a white rose bush, the same kind Dad used to grow, the kind he taught me to care for when I was a child. I brought it back, dug a hole in the centre of the garden and carefully planted it. I packed soil around the roots, watered it, made sure it was stable. Then I knelt in the dirt, my hands covered in earth, and whispered to the rose bush, to the garden, to my mother's memory, "You didn't know how to love me, Mum. But you taught me something more important, how to forgive, not for you, for me." The words felt like a release, like something I'd been carrying for 37 years finally being set down. I stood slowly brushing dirt from my jeans and looked around. The garden wasn't perfect. The grass was still too long, the fence still sagged, the rosebush was small and fragile. But it was a start, a beginning. Ryan came up beside me, his hands in his pockets. "It looks good." "It will," I said. "Eventually." As we stood there, the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds for the first time all day, casting golden light across the garden. The rose bush seemed to glow its white petals, catching the light. The air smelled like rain and earth and possibility. I wiped the last of my tears and smiled, really smiled for the first time in weeks. Now it was my turn to grow something beautiful from broken soil. The morning of the opening ceremony, I woke at dawn too anxious to sleep. I stood in my small apartment, drinking coffee by the window, watching the town wake up below me. 6 months ago, I'd been sitting in a courtroom fighting for my father's voice. Now I was about to open the doors to something that carried both his name and his legacy forward. The Parker Foundation. It had taken months of planning, filing paperwork, securing non-profit status, finding office space, hiring a small staff. Walter had helped me navigate the legal complexities. Mark had offered to serve on the board. Aunt Mary had donated furniture and supplies, and slowly, piece by piece, the foundation had taken shape. The office was small, just 3 rooms in a community centre on the east side of town, but it was ours. A reception area with comfortable chairs and pamphlets, a counselling room with soft lighting and a couch, and my office where I'd hung Dad's pocket watch on the wall beside a framed copy of his letter. The mission statement printed on every brochure and displayed on a sign by the door read, "For the daughters who were told they didn't belong. The Parker Foundation provides legal aid counselling and scholarships to women estranged from their families, because everyone deserves to be seen." By 10 a.m, people had started arriving. Former colleagues, neighbours, women who'd written to me some driving hours to be there, journalists with cameras. And in the back, standing together near the refreshment table, were Ryan and Aunt Mary. I greeted guests, shook hands, accepted congratulations, with a smile that felt both genuine and surreal. This was real. This was happening. Then, at exactly 10:30, I saw her. Emily stood in the doorway looking uncertain and small. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back, no makeup. She looked older than I remembered, thinner, more fragile, like she'd been carrying a weight too heavy for her frame. Our eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then slowly she walked toward me. "Hi," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of conversation. "Hi," I replied. We stood there, 2 sisters who'd spent a lifetime on opposite sides of a war. Neither of us had chosen not knowing how to bridge the space between us. "I'm sorry," Emily said finally, tears welling in her eyes. "For everything. For the video, for the lies, for everything. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know I'm sorry." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the enemy I'd fought in court, but a woman who'd been just as trapped as I was. trapped by Mum's expectations, by fear, by the need to be the favourite, because being anything less felt like annihilation. "We all just wanted love," I said softly. "That's all any of us wanted, and Mum didn't know how to give it, so we fought over the scraps." Emily nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I hated you for so long because I thought you took Dad from us, but you didn't. You just loved him the way we should have." I stepped forward and pulled her into a hug. She stiffened for a moment, then collapsed against me, sobbing into my shoulder. I held her tightly, feeling my own tears come. "Let's start there," I whispered. "Let's start with love." When we finally pulled apart, Ryan had joined us, his eyes red. The three of us stood together in the middle of the crowded room, and for the first time in our lives, we felt like siblings instead of strangers. At 11, I stepped to the front of the room and called for everyone's attention. The crowd quieted, turning toward me expectantly. "Thank you all for being here," I began, my voice steady despite the emotion churning inside me. 6 months ago, I won a court case that restored my father's will and gave me a share of his estate. But that victory came at a cost. It cost me my mother. It cost me years of peace. It cost my family nearly everything. I paused, looking around the room. But in the aftermath, something unexpected happened. I started receiving letters, hundreds of them, from women who'd been erased by their families, written out of wills, forgotten, dismissed, told they didn't matter. And I realised that what I'd fought for wasn't just personal, it was universal. I gestured to the office around us. The Parker Foundation exists because no one should have to fight alone the way I did. We provide free legal aid to women contesting estate fraud. We offer counselling for those healing from family estrangement, and we provide scholarships to help women rebuild their lives after loss. This foundation is built on my father's belief that everyone deserves to be seen, and it's built on my mother's lesson, painful as it was, that sometimes the only way to heal is to speak the truth. Applause filled the room, and I stepped back overwhelmed. Then from the crowd, a young woman raised her hand. "Can I say something?" I nodded. "Of course." She stood, and I recognised her face from one of the letters a woman named Sarah, 28 years old, who'd written about being disowned by her family when she came out. "My name is Sarah," she began, her voice shaking slightly. 3 years ago, my parents kicked me out of their house when I told them I was gay. They said I wasn't their daughter anymore. They wrote me out of their lives completely. I had nowhere to turn, no money for a lawyer, no one to help me fight for what I was owed, not just financially, but emotionally. She looked directly at me. When I read about Jessica's case, it gave me hope. And when I heard about this foundation, I reached out. Last month, with the help of a lawyer provided by the Parker Foundation, I won my case. My parents were forced to acknowledge me in my grandmother's will. But more than that, I finally felt like I mattered, like I wasn't invisible. Her voice broke and tears streamed down her face. This foundation didn't just give me a lawyer, it gave me hope. It gave me proof that I wasn't alone. I walked over to her and took her hand. "You're not alone anymore," I said. "None of us are." The room erupted in applause again, and Sarah hugged me tightly. As the event continued, people mingling, sharing stories, filling out intake forms for legal consultations, I stood with Ryan and Emily near the back, watching it all unfold. "Dad would be proud," Ryan said quietly. "Mom too?" Emily added, in her own way. I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into my chest. We stood together, the three of us, no longer defined by the family we were born into, but by the family we were choosing to become. For the first time, we were a family, not by blood, but by choice. The year after the foundation opened passed in a blur of purpose and exhaustion. I threw myself into the work meeting clients, reviewing legal cases, speaking at community events, training volunteer counsellors. The foundation grew faster than I'd anticipated. We expanded from 3 rooms to 6. We hired a full-time attorney and 2 case managers. Ryan joined the board. Even Emily, who'd moved back from California, started volunteering on weekends. But through it all, something kept pulling at me. A sense that my story, our story, could reach beyond the walls of that small office, beyond the women who walked through our doors. The letters still arrived daily from women across the country, across the world, telling me they'd seen themselves in my fight, and I realised if I wanted to reach them all, I needed to write it down. I started writing on a Tuesday night in November, sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of tea and my laptop. I began with the anniversary party, the moment Mum told me I wasn't part of the family, the moment everything cracked open. And once I started, I couldn't stop. I wrote about my childhood sleeping in the storage room, about college graduation standing alone on stage, about giving up Boston to care for Dad, about finding his letter, hearing his voice on the USB drive, standing in that church basement, holding his legacy in my hands. I wrote about the courtroom, the evidence, Dr. Crane's confession, about Ryan's testimony and Emily's breakdown, about Mum in the hospital telling me she'd been the forgotten daughter too. And I wrote about forgiveness, not the easy cinematic kind, but the messy, incomplete kind that happens when you choose to let go of anger because carrying it is destroying you. The writing was brutal. Some nights I cried so hard I had to close my laptop and walk away. Other nights the words poured out like a flood and I wrote until dawn. It took 6 months to finish the first draft. I sent it to a literary agent who'd reached out after reading an article about the foundation. She called me 2 days later. "This is the most powerful memoir I've read in years," she said. "We need to get this published." 3 months later, we signed with a publisher. And 6 months after that, I held the finished book in my hands for the first time. The cover was simple white, with my father's pocket watch, photographed against a soft background. The title in clean, black letters, "The Voice of Silence, A Daughter's Journey from Erasure to Empowerment." Underneath my name, Jessica Parker. The book launch was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at Henderson's Books, the independent bookstore in the centre of town. The owner, Margaret Henderson, no relation to my mother, though the name still made me flinch, had offered to host. She'd ordered 200 copies, which I thought was wildly optimistic. But when I arrived at 2 p.m, there was already a line stretching down the block. I stood frozen on the sidewalk staring at the crowd. Hundreds of women, young and old, alone and in groups, holding numbered tickets waiting to get inside. Some were crying, some were talking quietly to each other. Some just stood in silence, clutching advance copies of the book they'd ordered online. Margaret came out to greet me, her face flushed with excitement. "Jessica, we had to cap it at 300. We've never had a turnout like this." I walked inside in a daze. The bookstore had set up folding chairs in rows, but even with the extra seating, people lined the walls, sat on the floor, crowded into every available space. Ryan and Emily were sitting in the front row, Aunt Mary beside them, Mark and Walter a few rows back, and scattered throughout the crowd were faces I recognised, women I'd helped through the foundation, women who'd written to me, women whose names I didn't know but whose stories I carried. I sat at the signing table, my hands trembling, and looked out at the sea of faces. Margaret introduced me, her voice warm. "Jessica Parker's story is one of courage, truth, and the hard-won freedom that comes from refusing to be erased. Please, welcome her." The applause was deafening. I stood and walked to the podium, my heart pounding. I'd prepared remarks, but suddenly they felt inadequate, so I set my notes aside and just spoke. "A year and a half ago, I began. I stood in a restaurant and was told in front of 80 people that I wasn't part of my family. That moment broke me. But it also freed me. Because once you're told you don't belong, you stop trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for you, and you start building your own." I paused, looking around the room. This book is about that journey. It's about being invisible and then choosing to be seen. It's about the cost of truth, because truth always costs something. And it's about the unexpected grace of forgiveness, even when you never thought you'd be capable of it. I picked up a copy of the book and opened it to a passage I'd marked. "I want to read you something from the final chapter," I said. I took a breath and began, "Family isn't who claims you at birth. It's who stands with you when the world tries to erase you. It's who sees your worth when everyone else looks away. And if they won't stand with you, you build your own family one truth at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. Because belonging isn't something that's given, it's something you create. And the family you choose is often stronger than the family you're born into." My voice wavered, but I kept reading. "My father gave me his voice when he couldn't speak anymore. My mother in her final days gave me the truth she'd hidden her whole life. And in the wreckage of everything we lost, I found something I'd been searching for since I was 12 years old, the knowledge that I was enough, that I mattered, that I belonged not to them, but to myself." I closed the book and looked up. Every eye in the room was on me. Many were crying. "Thank you for being here," I said. "Thank you for seeing me. And for those of you who felt invisible, who've been erased, who've been told you don't belong, I see you. You matter. And you're not alone." The applause was thunderous. People stood wiping their eyes, holding their books to their chests like shields. For the next 3 hours, I signed books. Each person who approached the table had a story. Some told me theirs in whispered confessions. Others just squeezed my hand and said, "Thank you." One woman, 70 years old with white hair and kind eyes, stood in front of me and said through tears, "This is my story too. I've been waiting 50 years for someone to tell it. Thank you for telling it." I signed her book and wrote, "For every forgotten daughter, you were always enough. When the last person left and the bookstore finally closed, I sat at the empty table surrounded by stacks of books and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace." Ryan came up beside me. "You did it, Jess. You really did it." "We did it," I corrected. "All of us?" Emily, standing nearby, smiled. "Dad would be so proud." I looked down at the book in my hands at Dad's watch on the cover and whispered, "I hope so." The book became a lifeline for thousands, but for me, it was just the beginning. The decision to leave came on a quiet Tuesday morning, sitting in my apartment above the foundation office. I'd just finished a Zoom call with a reporter from The Atlantic who wanted to profile me for a feature on family estrangement. It was the third interview request that week. The book had opened doors I'd never expected: speaking engagements, podcast invitations, offers to consult on legal cases across the country. And I was exhausted. Not physically tired, though I was that too, but so tired. Tired of being Jessica Parker, the daughter who fought back. Tired of carrying other people's stories on top of my own. Tired of living in the town where everyone knew what had happened, where I couldn't walk into the grocery store without someone approaching me to share their own family trauma. I needed to disappear. Not from the work. The foundation would continue. The book would continue reaching people, but from the spotlight. I needed to remember who I was when I wasn't fighting. So I typed "small coastal towns, Oregon teaching jobs" into a search engine and started scrolling. 6 weeks later, I moved to Seal Cove, a town of 3,000 people tucked between cliffs and ocean, 2 hours north of Portland. The community college there had an opening for a part-time English instructor, teaching adult learners in their continuing education program. The pay was modest. The position was unglamorous. It was perfect. I rented a small cottage at the edge of town, 1 bedroom wood floors, a porch that overlooked the ocean. The first morning I woke up there, I stood on that porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the water, and I cried. Not from sadness, but from relief. For the first time in 2 years, no one was asking me to be strong. No one needed me to tell my story. I was just a woman drinking coffee by the ocean, watching seagulls circle, listening to waves crash against rocks below. I started teaching that fall. My class met twice a week in a small classroom with wide windows overlooking the campus courtyard. I had 15 students, mostly women ranging in age from 23 to 67. Some were returning to school after raising children. Others were recovering from divorces, job losses, personal crises. A few were simply pursuing dreams they'd deferred for decades. They didn't know who I was. The name Jessica Parker meant nothing to them. I was just Ms. Parker, their English teacher, who assigned essays about identity and resilience and asked them to write about moments when they'd found their voices. I loved it. One afternoon in October, we were discussing a memoir by Cheryl Strayed when a student named Angela, 42, recently divorced, rebuilding her life after her ex-husband left her with nothing raised her hand. "Ms. Parker, can I ask you something personal?" I set down my book. "Of course." "I read your book," she said quietly. The voice of silence. "My sister recommended it. I didn't realize you were that Jessica Parker until I saw your author photo." The room went still. The other students looked at me with renewed interest. I nodded slowly. "That's me." Angela hesitated, then asked, "Did your family ever really love you?" The question hung in the air. I could have deflected, could have steered the conversation back to the lesson. But these were women who'd trusted me with their own stories, their own pain. They deserved honesty. "Yes," I said finally, my voice gentle. "But love is sometimes buried under fear. My mother loved me, I think. But she was so afraid of being abandoned that she pushed everyone away, including me. My father loved me deeply, but he was too afraid of conflict to stand up for me. And my siblings loved me, but they loved safety more." I paused, looking around the room. My job wasn't to dig up their love, it was to find my own worth without needing theirs. Because if you spend your whole life waiting for someone else to see your value, you'll miss the only person who can actually give it to you yourself. Angela wiped her eyes. "How did you do that? Find your worth, I mean." Slowly, I admitted, and painfully, I had to stop measuring my value by whether they chose me and start measuring it by whether I chose myself. Every day I asked, am I living for them or for me? And when the answer was for them, I made a different choice. Another student, Maria, spoke up. "But don't you miss them? Your family?" "Sometimes," I said honestly, "I miss the family I wanted us to be. But I don't miss the one we actually were. And I've built a new family now, one based on choice and honesty and mutual respect. It looks different than I imagined, but it's real." The conversation shifted after that, and we returned to discussing Strayed's memoir. But something had changed in the room, a new openness, a sense that we were all walking the same path, just at different points along it. After class, several students stayed behind to share their own stories of family estrangement, of choosing themselves. And I listened no longer as Jessica Parker, the advocate, but as Jessica Parker, the teacher, the human being, the woman who understood. That evening, I walked home along the coastal trail, the sun setting over the ocean in shades of orange and pink. My cottage was small and simple, but it was mine. I'd planted white roses in the garden, 3 bushes, now thriving in the salty air. I'd hung Dad's pocket watch on the wall beside the window, where the morning light caught it. Every morning, I followed the same ritual wake at dawn, make coffee, sit on the porch and listen. Not to the demands of others, not to the noise of expectation, but to the waves, to the birds, to the quiet voice inside me that had spent 37 years being drowned out. I wore Dad's pocket watch on a long chain around my neck, now close to my heart. Sometimes when I touched it, I imagined I could still hear him, not in words, but in presence. A reminder that love, real love, doesn't disappear. It just transforms. That night I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The ocean crashed rhythmically below a sound that had become as familiar as my own breathing. I thought about the girl I'd been 12 years old sleeping in a storage room, convinced that if she just tried harder, gave more, stayed quieter, she'd finally be enough. And I thought about the woman I'd become scarred, stronger, free. I'd spent so many years afraid of silence, afraid that if I stopped talking, stopped fighting, stopped proving, I'd disappear. But sitting there wrapped in stillness, I realised something profound, and I learned that silence isn't emptiness. It's the space where you finally hear yourself. The morning of the ceremony, I woke in a hotel room in my hometown, a place I'd avoided for over a year, preferring the peace of my coastal life to the memories embedded in these streets. But today felt different. Today, I wasn't returning as the forgotten daughter or the woman who'd fought a bitter legal battle. I was returning as someone who had transformed pain into purpose. The award ceremony was held at the state capitol building in a grand hall with marble floors and soaring ceilings. 300 people filled the seats, advocates, politicians, journalists, and women from the foundation who travelled to be there. When I walked in wearing a simple navy dress and Dad's pocket watch on a chain around my neck, I saw familiar faces scattered throughout the crowd. Ryan sat in the third row, his wife beside him, their 2 children squirming in their seats. Emily was there too, sitting with her teenage daughter. She'd reconciled with her husband and moved back to town 6 months ago. Aunt Mary was in the front row, her eyes already misty. And beside her sat Mark Reynolds, who'd become not just a colleague, but my closest friend, the person who'd believed in me when I barely believed in myself. The governor gave a speech about courage and advocacy, about the importance of fighting for those whose voices had been silenced. Then she called my name. I walked to the podium, accepted the Crystal Award, heavy and cold in my hands, and stood before the crowd. 3 years ago, I began. I stood in a courtroom and fought for my father's voice. I thought that was the end of the story, but it turned out to be the beginning. I looked out at the audience, at the faces of women I'd helped, women I'd never met, but who'd written to me, women who'd found courage in my story. This award isn't just mine. It belongs to every woman who's ever been erased, dismissed, or told she doesn't belong. It belongs to the 1,200 women the Parker Foundation has helped. It belongs to my father who left me the courage to fight. And it belongs to my mother who taught me painfully that sometimes we hurt people because we're hurting ourselves. My voice wavered slightly, but I steadied it. I don't believe in perfect endings. I believe in honest ones. My family will never be what I wanted it to be when I was 12 years old. But it's become something better, something real. And I've learnt that the family you choose is often stronger than the family you're born into. I held up the award. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for hearing me. And to every woman out there who feels invisible, you matter. You always did. The applause was deafening. People stood and I saw women in the audience crying, holding each other, nodding in recognition. After the ceremony, Mark pulled me into a tight hug. You did it, Jess. You really did it. We did it, I corrected, echoing the words I'd said a year ago at the book launch. He pulled back and looked at me seriously. No, you did. You didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for all of us who were told we didn't matter. You proved that we do. Ryan and Emily approached next, and the 3 of us stood together for a moment before Emily said quietly, Dad would be so proud. So would Mum, I added, in her own complicated way. That evening, I drove back to Oregon, the award sitting in the passenger seat beside me. When I finally pulled into the driveway of my cottage, after the long drive, the sun was setting over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. I carried the award inside and set it on the bookshelf beside my other treasures, Dad's pocket watch, a first edition of my book, a framed letter from a woman I'd helped, who wrote, You gave me back my voice. Then I retrieved the 2 photographs from my suitcase. The first was the old family portrait, the one I dropped and shattered on the morning of the anniversary party. I'd had it professionally restored, the glass, replaced, the frame polished. We all stood there, Mum, Dad, Emily, Ryan and me, at the edge, slightly separated. But now, instead of seeing rejection, I saw a family doing the best they could with the tools they had. Imperfect, broken, human. I placed it on the mantel. Beside it, I set the second photograph taken 6 months ago at the Foundation's 3rd anniversary gala. In it, I stood in the centre of a group of 30 women, all of us smiling, arms around each other. Some were clients we'd helped, others were volunteers, a few were board members, but all of them were family, the family I'd built one truth at a time. I lit a candle and placed it between the 2 photographs, watching the flame flicker in the growing darkness. As I stood there, I heard Dad's voice in my mind, not a memory, but a presence, a knowing. I'm proud of you, Jess. You turned silence into song. Tears slipped down my cheeks, but I was smiling. I walked to my desk and opened the leather journal I'd been keeping for the past 3 years, a record of my journey, my healing, my transformation. I turned to a fresh page and wrote, 3 years ago, I fought for justice. 2 years ago, I built a foundation. 1 year ago, I found peace. And tonight, I finally understand what it all meant. I spent 37 years looking for a place in their picture. I bent myself into impossible shapes, made myself small, swallowed my voice, hoping that if I just tried hard enough, I'd finally belong. But belonging isn't something you earn. It's something you claim. Now I've built my own frame, and it's big enough for everyone who needs one. For the forgotten daughters, the erased sisters, the women who were told they don't matter. There's room here. There's always room. I closed the journal and set down my pen. I walked out onto the porch, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders, and stood looking at the ocean. The moon was rising full and bright, casting silver light across the water. The waves crashed rhythmically below, eternal and unchanging. I touched the pocket watch hanging around my neck and whispered into the night, "Thank you, Dad, for everything." The wind picked up, carrying the salt smell of the sea, and for just a moment I felt him there, not as a ghost, but as a presence, a certainty that love doesn't end, it just transforms. I thought about the girl I'd been sleeping in a storage room, convinced she was too much and not enough all at once. And I thought about the woman I'd become, scarred, whole free. I smiled, feeling the truth of it, settled deep in my bones. And this time, she finally believed it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late spring, 5 years after I'd stood on the porch of my cottage and felt for the first time that I truly belonged to myself. I'd been watering the white roses in my garden when I heard the mail truck pull away. I walked to the mailbox expecting bills and advertisements, but found instead a cream-coloured envelope with careful handwriting I recognised immediately. Emily's. I stood there in the driveway holding the envelope, my heart beating faster than it should. We'd maintained a careful distance over the past few years. Polite emails on birthdays, brief updates through Ryan, the occasional message on holidays. But we'd never pushed beyond that fragile boundary, never tested whether the wounds had healed enough to bear weight. I carried the letter inside, set it on my kitchen table, and stared at it for a full minute before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded carefully and a photograph. The photo showed a little girl, maybe 4 years old, with dark curls and Emily's smile. She was holding a dandelion, her face bright with joy. On the back, in Emily's handwriting, Lily, "Your niece." I unfolded the letter. "Dear Jess, I don't know if you'll want to read this. I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away, but I'm hoping you'll give me a chance. This is Lily. She's 4 years old. She loves books and flowers and asking impossible questions. She's smart and stubborn and kind, everything I want her to be. Last week, she asked me why she doesn't have an Aunt Jess like her friends have aunts. And I realised I've been robbing her of something precious, the chance to know you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I'm asking for a new beginning. Will you come meet your niece? I'd like her to know the aunt I should have seen all along. We're living in Seattle now." There's a park near our house where Lily loves to feed the ducks. If you're willing, I'd love for you to join us there. No pressure, no expectations, just an invitation. I'm sorry it took me so long. Love, Emily. I read the letter 3 times, my hands trembling, tears blurring the words. I looked at the photograph again, at Lily's bright face, at the dandelion clutched in her small hand, at the pure joy of a child who didn't yet know how complicated families could be. I set the letter on my desk next to Dad's pocket watch and sat in silence for a long time. Part of me wanted to protect myself, to maintain the careful distance that had kept me safe. But another part, a stronger part, remembered sitting in Mum's hospital room, hearing her confession too late, wishing we'd had more time. I picked up my phone and called Emily. She answered on the second ring, her voice tentative. Jess? I got your letter, I said, and I'd love to meet her. Emily's breath caught. Really? Really. We made plans for 3 months later, enough time for both of us to prepare, to think, to decide what we wanted this to be. On a Saturday morning in August, I drove to Seattle. The park Emily had mentioned was small and green with a pond where ducks glided lazily across the water. I arrived early, my stomach tight with nerves, and sat on a bench near the playground. Then I saw them. Emily walked toward me holding the hand of a little girl in a yellow dress. Lily looked exactly like her photograph, dark curls, bouncing eyes bright with curiosity. Emily stopped a few feet away, her face uncertain. Hi. Hi, I said, standing. Lily looked up at me with those bright, fearless eyes. Are you Aunt Jess? I knelt down to her level. I am? Mommy says you write books. I do. I like books, Lily announced seriously, especially ones about dragons. I smiled. Me too. Emily gestured to the bench. Can we sit? The 3 of us sat together, Lily between us, chattering about ducks and dragons and the dandelions growing at the edge of the grass. After a few minutes, she hopped down and ran toward a patch of flowers, carefully picking dandelions. Emily and I sat in silence watching her. I'm sorry it took me so long, Emily said quietly, to see you, to understand. I looked at her, my sister, who'd been my enemy and my family all at once. I know. Do you think we can ever... She trailed off, not sure how to finish. I don't know, I said honestly, but I think we can try. Lily ran back her small hands full of dandelions. Look, she said, holding them up proudly. They're beautiful, I told her. She held one up to her mouth and blew. The seeds scattered on the wind, floating away in different directions, carried by forces we couldn't control. Emily watched her daughter with tears in her eyes. She doesn't know what we lost. No, I agreed, but maybe she can help us find something new. Lily came and sat on my lap, surprising me with her easy trust. She smelled like sunshine and strawberries. Will you read me a story? She asked. I'd love to, I said. Emily pulled a children's book from her bag, and I read aloud while Lily leaned against me, her small body warm and solid. Emily sat beside us listening, and for the first time in 37 years, the 3 of us existed together, without weapons, without walls, without the weight of everything we'd broken. When the story ended, Lily ran off to chase more dandelions. Emily turned to me. Thank you, she said, for coming, for giving us a chance. We're here now, I said. That's what matters. As I drove home that evening, the sun setting over the highway, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The anniversary party where I'd been erased, the courtroom where I'd been heard, the hospital where Mum had finally told the truth, the cottage where I'd learned to hear myself. Some families are born, some are built. Some are broken and rebuilt, piece by fragile piece. Mine was all 3. And in the end, I learned that the voice of silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the beginning of truth. I pulled into my driveway as the last light faded from the sky. I walked to the porch, looked out at the ocean, and felt Dad's presence not as memory, but as certainty. I'd spent 37 years fighting to be seen, 5 more learning to see myself. And now, finally, I understood. Freedom wasn't something I won in a courtroom, or found in a book, or built in a foundation. Freedom was choosing every day to believe I was enough. And finally, I was free. Thank you so much for staying with me through Jessica's entire journey. From that devastating moment at the anniversary party, when her mother told her she wasn't part of the family, all the way to that peaceful afternoon in the park with her niece Lily blowing dandelion seeds into the wind. This story is about so much more than a legal battle over a will. It's about what happens when you finally stop waiting for people to see your worth and start claiming it for yourself. It's about the courage it takes to speak truth when silence has been your survival strategy for decades. And it's about discovering that the family you choose can be stronger than the family you're born into. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever had to fight to be heard, please let me know in the comments below. Share your own story. Tell me which moment hit you hardest. Was it when Jessica read her father's letter at the anniversary party, when she confronted her mother with the recordings? Or maybe it was that final scene of forgiveness and new beginnings. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We share stories like this every week. Stories about real people finding their voices, standing up for themselves, and building lives they're proud of. Your support means everything, and I truly believe these stories can change lives just like they've changed mine. What would you have done in Jessica's situation? Would you have fought or walked away? I really want to hear your perspective. Drop a comment, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and remember you matter. You always did.